two items are the two separate pairs of panties. First, the pink panties, which again bear my laboratory sticker and initials. The panties, they were intact when I received them. It's common that I will cut the sides in order to open it for my examinations and make it a little more prominent. But this is the pink pair, and you can see there's a small cutting where I sampled for DNA analysis. And then also, excuse me, the red pair is item 4E, again with these sides cut so that I can examine. But this would be that second pair of panties. I did, for return, choose to package them in this heat-sealed container so that they were separate, but that was just kind of an ease of transport type thing so that my print examiners could get at the other items that were in here and not necessarily have to worry about contamination on this. The other thing that's actually included in here is the slide that I prepared. This is the slide that I prepared in the laboratory from the cutting from the pair of pink panties where I located some sperm cells that were present on there. Excuse me.
And as far as record number 7 goes, is that essentially reflecting the work you did, the initial work you did on the known buckle of the defendant, as well as the work on the 2 pairs of underwear?
That is correct.
Anything in that record that's different than the original that you sent to the investigators?
No, it is not.
Your Honor, I move for the admission of People's 233.
Be received. What was 232?
232, oh, 232, Judge, is a housekeeping matter. We can take care of it.
Okay, so it's out.
It's out, yeah. All right. Okay. Handing you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 234. Let's talk about that for a second. Give me 1 second. Okay. What are we looking at here?
People's Exhibit 234 is a copy of my excuse me, first DNA laboratory report under this laboratory number. Excuse me, second. I guess I did the firearms. Record number 8, the laboratory number is GR16-2492. And again, this is the initial bulk of the evidence that was screened, everything in that toolbox. There are several known samples that are present here. On page 1, there's a listing of all of the different evidence items. You'll see that first, the first 2 items that are listed are the DNA reference sample from Jessica Herringa and the DNA reference sample from Rebecca Blech. Neither of those items are items that I physically handled at this time of this report. All of our data is kept electronically in our computer systems, so I went into the computer and I was able to pull those DNA profiles so that I would have them for comparison, but I didn't actually handle any of those reference samples at this time. The next 2 items, the DNA from Jeffrey Willis and then the DNA from NJN, are the 2 DNA reference samples that I had, and those were actually processed during the course of this. And then there was a series of evidence items, and I believe these are the first 10 or 11 items, depending on how you count them, the first evidentiary items that we decided to forward for DNA analysis. And then in the middle of page 2, you can see a listing of all of the other evidence items that were swabbed and prepared for DNA, but not actually handled for DNA, not actually processed for DNA at this point.
I just want to go back to your earlier comment on once a known sample is processed, i.e. whether it's a buccal swab or some other fashion, so the lab does what it does, either cutting the swab and processing it, that known sample, do you need to go back? For example, Rebecca Blech's profile was put together in 2014. Did you have to go back at the vial of blood or the stain card and reproduce that, or how does that work?
Yeah, so once we have a DNA profile in hand, it's a printout, it's a series of peaks, it's a DNA profile, it's a series of numbers. There's no requirement for me to go back and actually handle that evidence. So specifically in the case of the DNA profile from Rebecca Blech, I actually never handled that sample. That was done by one of the other analysts in the laboratory. I merely went into our computer system and grabbed their data and borrowed their data for comparisons in my current case. So the Rebecca Blech sample, I actually have never handled the known reference sample from her. The DNA profile, at this point, the DNA profile from Jessica Herringa is the same profile that I had analyzed previously back in 2013. We did have a switchover in some of our kit chemistries, and so this known profile from Jessica Herringa is actually a little less informative than the known profiles we're working with now, because we're looking at more locations, more loci, when this report is in place. I still just had the initial DNA profile from Jessica Herringa. There will be a point in time where I actually went back and I did reprofile her DNA sample so that I could get a more complete picture of her genetic profile. But at this point, it was just the data that was obtained previously.
All right. So obviously, we spent a long time before lunch kind of going through all the things that you either you analyzed and either cut or didn't cut. And I think you indicated this is just a portion of that right now. And this report indicates the things that you sent on and the things that were held off for the moment.
That's correct.
Okay. So let's talk about the things that you actually did do to go and analyze. And Mr. Hayers, I'm not sure what's easiest if we're dealing with the statistical stuff. As we go through it, you want to bounce back and forth? Is that
Probably with a number of items, it might be easier.
just so that I can manage making sure the jury sees all that?
Yep. Yeah. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. All right. So, what system or what method did you use to examine?
So at the time of this report, we used primarily the same DNA technologies that we've used for years, only the last step, that kit chemistry. At this point, we had moved on to using the PowerPlex fusion system. Again, this is a kit that looks at 24 specific locations as compared to the older technology, which was the PowerPlex 16 hot start. That would be the reference sample from Jessica Herringa. Now we actually have more locations that we're looking at, more data, and gives us more information.
All right. So, let's start with the swab of the passenger side manual door lock.
Okay, so the first item is GR16-2492-L1X, and again, that's the swab of that manual door lock from the van. Went through the DNA analysis process. At the end, I obtained a mixture of DNA types. At this point in my career, since then I've gotten qualified on this new computer statistical modeling, but at this point I was still in the training mode, so when it comes to a mixture, I'm limited to something that is either very clearly a major and minor, or something that is much more level, and I was not actually processing for that statistical modeling program yet. So at this point for this item, I was able to conclude, yes, it is a mixture of multiple contributors, and I think that this sample would be better served by using that statistical modeling. And so I actually, the note here is further analysis of this DNA profile will be the subject of a subsequent report. I basically gave all of my data for that specific item, along with the reference samples that we've developed so far, and I passed that along to another scientist, Michelle Schmidt, who was actually qualified in using this technology. So the limit of mine at this point is that it's a mixture, and it'll be better served by her analysis.
And just so the jury understands, so as you're running these items, or look at the profiles of these items, you're running them against the 4 known samples above. Is that correct?
That's correct. At the time of this report, the only 4 reference samples that I had available were the ones that are listed above: Jeffrey Willis, MJN, Jessica Herringa, and Rebecca Blech. At a later date, we'll do some more comparisons of these evidence items, but at this point, it's just against those 4 nodes.
Okay, so you've talked about the passenger side manual lock. Let's talk about the work you did on the red ball on the ball game.
Okay. The next item, GR16-2492-L8AX. Again, that was the swab of the red ball from that ball gag. I got a DNA profile. It was a single source profile, but it was a partial profile. So I got DNA results. They did appear to be from one individual, not multiple individuals, but it was also not a complete profile. Some of the DNA types had dropped out because of degradation or quantity, or it was something less than a full profile. But it was a partial profile from a male contributor. I compared that against the DNA profile from Jeffrey Willis, and the partial DNA profile from the swab on the red ball gag matches the DNA profile from Jeffrey Willis. Now again, anytime we have an association between a piece of evidence and a known, I'm required to provide a statistic. And in this case, it's a random match statistic, and it shows up on page 6, statistic number 1. And what this does is it uses population databases to see those DNA types that are present there, how rare or how common they are, and it will generate a statistic so that you may know the probability of selecting an unrelated individual from the general population at random who also matches this swab of the red ball gag. And that would be 1 in 50.486 sextillion in a Caucasian population, 1 in 7.886 septillion in African American population, and 1 in 1.036 septillion in a Hispanic population.
And how many, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot here, how many zeros are we talking about when we talk about sex?
I don't want to misstate it, so I always walk through it in my head. We go from thousands to millions, millions to billions, billions to trillions, to quadrillions, quintillions, sextillions, and septillions. So that's the neighborhood we're in. We're several steps above the millions, billions territory.
Okay. All right. All right. After the did you compare that profile against the other knowns that you had?
Yeah. So as policy, even if we think we already have a match established, we will compare against all the knowns that are present. So I additionally compared that partial profile from the ball gag against MJN, Jessica Herringa, and Rebecca Blech's DNA profiles, and they are all excluded as being possible donors to the DNA that was obtained from that red ball gag.
Okay. Next item was the, I guess, L10AX, your swab of the end of the dildo/vibrator.
Yeah. Again, item L10AX, the swab of the end of the dildo vibrator, also indicated that it was a mixture. And I saw the presence of more than one individual. And this is, again, a scenario where I think that the computer modeling would better serve doing comparisons. So again, this is an instance where I simply provided my data to Michelle Schmidt so that she could use that computer statistical modeling to do the comparisons.
All right. Let's talk about item L11AX, your work on the end of the silver vibrator.
Yeah, so the end of the silver vibrator, item GR162492-L11AX, gave a DNA profile that was consistent with a mixture of two individuals. This is a situation where there was a major donor profile, so I was able to, at each of those locations, determine which peaks were present from the major donor and then peaks that were present from a minor donor. The major donor from this item actually was from an unknown donor. It was an unidentified female donor at this point. I also did comparisons against that major donor, against the 4 reference samples that we have thus far. And all of these individuals are excluded as being possible contributors to that major profile. That would be Jeffrey Willis, MJN, Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech. They're all excluded. And then also of note, that minor donor, again, the mixture of 2, that minor donor, those DNA types were so low in this profile that there's really no way to make a reliable comparison against them. Even if you and I were to know, without a shadow of a doubt, who left that those types are low enough that I would not be able to make a good type of a comparison to that. So again, this is a situation where the major DNA profile is able to be compared, but the minor is just insufficient.
Okay. Next was the work as it relates to the swab of the interior, the leather restraints, and again, describe what this is that we're talking about.
Yeah, again, item GR16-2492-L18AX. This is the swab of the interior of those leather restraints. That would be that inside cuff portion that I swabbed. The DNA results are consistent with being a mixture of 2 individuals. Again, this is an instance where I was able to determine some major DNA types and then some minor types. After determining what those major DNA types are and documenting them, I compare it against the references we have thus far. And on this item, Jeffrey Willis matches the major donor to the swabs from this leather restraints. And then there's a statistic that's listed below. It's number 2 on page 6. And again, this would be the probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the population who also has the same DNA types as the major DNA profile from the swab of the leather restraints would be 1 in 1.796 septillion in a Caucasian population, 1 in 1.220 octillion in an African American population, and 1 in 220.1 septillion in a Hispanic population.
So if I remember your example, which is a good one, I'm going to remember that. Septillion is one more zero than sextillion.
That's correct.
Okay.
Quintillion, sextillion, septillion, and octillion. Those are the neighborhood we're in again.
Now, again, did you compare it to the other 3?
That's correct. The other 3 individuals that I have DNA profiles for at this time are all excluded as being the major donor to that swab from the leather restraints. And then likewise, that minor donor profile is low enough that it's insufficient for any kind of a meaningful comparison.
All right. Let's talk about your work now on L38AX. This is, if I'm reading your report correctly, the swab of the stain on the end of the muzzle, not on the interior, but on the end.
That's correct. Initially, the end, that stain on the muzzle end of the gun was sent as item L38AX. This DNA profile, again, actually was a partial DNA profile, so it's something less than the full complement of each of the locations we look at. It also indicated that it was a mixture, so there's DNA present from more than one individual. I was able to determine a major DNA profile from this item at some of those locations. Again, it's not a major at every location because we know we're already working with something less. But I was able to document a major donor profile and then make comparisons. The major, Jeffrey Willis matches the major DNA profile from the swab of the stain on the muzzle end of the .22 handgun. And again, because there's a match between Mr. Willis and that stain, the major donor on that stain, there's a statistic that's represented. It's number 3 on page 6. Be the probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the population who also has a DNA profile that matches that major DNA profile from the swab of the handgun is 1 in 1.935 quadrillion in a Caucasian population, 1 in 14.01 quadrillion in an African American population, and 1 in 10.43 quadrillion in a Hispanic population.
Before we get to the next ones, I just want you to be able to point out to the jury exactly where you're getting this. So this is People's Exhibit 191. Is this the Walther P22 that we're talking about that you examined?
Exhibit number 191 is a box containing, has our laboratory sticker on it. And it is the Walther P22. At the time that I swabbed it, the slide was actually not back when I received it. The staining was present on this outer surface. It was very lightly visible. That's the portion that I swabbed as item L38AX. The next item, L38CX, is actually after removing this slide, actually sliding it back, but then I think our firearms examiner actually removed it completely. There was some staining that was visible in and around this barrel portion, and that would be the second portion of this, the second sampling of the staining that was swabbed for DNA analysis. So 38AX is the end, 38CX is around that barrel portion, and then at some point there's going to be a grip and trigger swab, which I actually think is in a later report, and that would be the swab of the grip, and then the trigger portions, again, for the person who would have been handling this firearm.
All right. Thank you for that. So let's talk about CX. Or I guess, before I do that, did you compare, and I'm still talking about AX, did you compare that to the other knowns that you
Yes, I did. 38AX was additionally compared against MJN, the DNA profile from Jessica Herringa, and the DNA profile from Rebecca Blech, and each of those individuals are excluded as being the major donor for the stain on the muzzle end of that .22 handgun.
Now let's talk about CX, that interior that you were just talking about.
Yeah, so very similarly, DNA profiling was done. The DNA types obtained from that swab of the interior of the handgun slide was consistent with a mixture of at least 2 individuals. This is another instance where a major DNA profile was able to be documented and then compared. And when comparing, Jeffrey Willis, the DNA from Jeffrey Willis matches the major DNA profile from item L38CX. And there's a statistic number 4 on page 6. Again, probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random who also matches this major DNA profile would be 1 in 192.4 septillion in a Caucasian population, 1 in 282.4 octillion in an African American population, and 1 in 15.68 octillion in a Hispanic population. One other note, I guess, as long as we're on this page, the reason there are different statistics for each of these pieces of evidence, although they match similarly, each of those items of evidence has more or less data that's present, and having more or less data allows me to have a slightly different statistical estimate because I'm dealing with a little more information for one sample or a little less for another sample. So that's why, although these items sound like they are matching similarly, the statistics are all represented differently, and that's based on the actual piece of evidence itself.
Well, and you bring up a good point now, just if I can follow up with a question. So that when we're talking about the handgun, which is referenced in statistic number 3 and statistic number 4, statistic number 3 was associated with, I think you referenced a partial DNA profile versus statistic number 4, which, since it didn't say partial, was that a full DNA profile?
That is correct. There's data that was obtained at each of the locations. Again, it's still a mixture, but there was more data that was present. It was data at each of those locations that we look at. And that's why there's that corresponding difference in the statistical estimate. The second, statistic number 4, is actually a stronger statistic than number 3 because looking at more information, I'm able to put more information into that calculation.
Okay. And did you, again, as it relates to the interior swab of that handgun, did you run it against the other knowns you had at the time?
Yes, again, it was compared against the DNA profiles from MJN, Jessica Herringa, and Rebecca Blech, and each of those individuals is excluded as being the major donor to the stain on the interior of the slide portion of that gun.
Okay. Now, I know in both the muzzle swab and the interior swab, the minor donor, the information is essentially the same. And I know you've said this over and over again, but just to repeat it, could you ever make a determination on the minor donor?
Again, that the DNA that's present, the levels of DNA that are present from that minor donor on each of those samples is low enough that there's no way to make a good comparison against any reference samples, and so no comparison was done on either of those. Those minor donors are just too low. They're insufficient.
Okay. Let's talk about L43X, the swab you did of, I think you classified it as kind of a stain on the van cargo floor.
So this was the stain that initially at the scene I tested. It had some indications with luminol that it might be blood. Testing in a laboratory did not bear that out. It was negative for the presence of blood. It was sent for DNA anyway, and this is an item that was forwarded for DNA analysis. Again, this is an instance where I observed what appeared to be more than one contributor. It is a mixture, and it is not a mixture where I could say there's a major donor or a minor donor. So for this item, I turned my data over to forensic scientist Schmidt, and she used the computer modeling on this item.
All right. Let's talk about item number 4E1X. Looks like the swab of the red panties, or the waistband of the red panties. What were you able to determine on that?
Okay. So, yes, item GR162492-4E1X. Again, that's the swab of that interior waistband, looking to see who potentially they belong to. It was consistent with being a mixture of at least 2 donors. One of those donors did appear to be a male contributor. We have one location that helps us to determine gender, and at least one of those donors was male, and at least one of them was an unknown DNA profile.
What were you able to determine as it relates to the known samples you had at that time?
So on a mixture such as this, it's a slightly different, again, it's a mixture. This is not an instance where I could say there's necessarily a major or a minor, but this is something where I will represent any comparisons as far as an inclusion. The comparison is slightly different. It's the idea of looking at all the DNA types that are present at all the locations and comparing reference samples and seeing if that individual's DNA types are present or not. It is reported with a mixture statistic, so it's a slightly different way that I calculate the statistics, and it would be the idea of taking all of the DNA types that are present at any given location, comparing against a known sample, whether it's the 4 parties involved here or my profile or any other profile, and see, are those DNA types present in this mixture? They could be included as being a possible donor, or are the DNA types from an individual not present in this mixture, so they would be excluded. So first I compared the DNA profile from Jeffrey Willis, and he is included as a possible contributor to the entire mixture of DNA profile, or DNA types, from the swab of the waistband red panties. Again, there's a statistic involved, number 5. And again, this is a slightly different, this statistic is calculated slightly different than when we have a single source profile or a major donor type profile. This statistic is generated by comparing all of the DNA types that are present, not trying to assign them and say these belong to this individual or that individual, but all of the DNA types that are present in the mixture, and then comparing and seeing how many people from the general population would also be included. So by its nature, it's not quite as strong of a statistical estimate, which is why the numbers are lower. But the probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the population who might also be included in this mixture of DNA types from that waistband would be 1 in 930.2 thousand in a Caucasian population, 1 in 18.45 million in an African American population, and 1 in 2.517 million in a Hispanic population. So you can see these numbers are much smaller. The probability of finding somebody who also might have DNA types that could be in that mixture is more of a chance, I would say. But you know, there is they are somewhat rare in that they are the number of DNA types that are present in each of those locations. So.
All right. Now you also, so I don't forget, you also compared it against the other known.
That is correct. The other 3 knowns, similar process. Look at the entire mixture of DNA types and compare against each of those knowns individually. And for both MJN, Jessica Herringa, and Rebecca Blech, each of them are excluded as being included in that possible mixture. DNA types that are required from their DNA profile were missing from that mixture at some point or another, so I can say that they could not have been the donor to the mixture of DNA types at each of those locations.
All right. And then you did some work on, I guess, a couple of different F1 and F2. Can you describe that? It's the same pair of underwear, is that correct?
This is actually the other pair of underwear. It's the pink panties, and specifically items GR16, 2492, 4D2. F1 is the first item at the top, and then F2 is the second item that's listed here. This is that sampling from the stain, that seminal fluid stain in the crotch of the pink panties. Anytime there's seminal fluid, sperm cells that are identified in a sample, we have available a technique that we will use. It's called a differential extraction. And at the very first step of DNA analysis processing, what I will do is attempt to separate the sperm cells from that sample from everything else that is present. So it would be all the skin cells, all of the other white blood cells, things that are going on there. And what that'll do is allow me to try to get 2 separate samples, but it'll allow me to try to get a more concentrated profile from potentially from that semen donor and then from the other donors that are present. So the 2 items that are listed here, F1 is actually this portion. It's all of the skin cells, white blood cells, all of the everything else that's present in that seminal fluid stain. And then the next item, F2, that's my attempt at getting just that semen profile, just the DNA profile from that sperm cell donor. Because they're split at that very first step in analysis, they actually get 2 separate conclusions because, in effect, they've become 2 separate items that are related by their origin. The first item, that DNA profile from Fraction 1, the stain in the pink panties, Fraction 1, I actually obtained a female DNA profile. Is an unidentified female. And specifically, I've noticed as unknown donor number 2. The previous item, that DNA profile from that unknown donor, that unknown female donor, it was the same DNA profile. So that would indicate to me that the panties probably came from the same individual, but at this time we don't know who this individual is. And then additionally, the other 4 reference samples I have, Jeffrey Willis, MJN, Jessica Herringa, and Rebecca Blech, are all excluded as being the possible donor to that Fraction 1, that initial stain from the pink panties. The Fraction 2, again, that's my attempt at getting those sperm cells. That DNA profile was consistent with a mixture of 2 individuals. At least one of them was a male contributor, and at least one of them was an unknown female contributor. Again, that donor number 2 that we see the same DNA profile. That donor number 2 is still unidentified at this point. However, when I look at the mixture of all the DNA types that's present, the DNA profile from Jeffrey Willis is actually included as being a possible contributor to that mixture of DNA types. And again, because it's a mixture, the statistic is that the mixtures type statistic, and it would be number 6. The probability of selecting another individual from random who also would be included in this stain in the crotch of the pink panties would be 1 in 222.2 thousand Caucasian population, 1 in 102.8 thousand in African American population, and 1 in 317.7 thousand in a Hispanic population.
And did you compare F2 to the other knowns?
Yes, I did. The other 3 samples, MJN, Jessica Herringa, and Rebecca Blech, were also compared against that mixture of DNA types that were present. And in each case, there were DNA types from their DNA profiles that were missing from the mixture, so they are excluded as being possible contributors to the DNA from Fraction 2 of that semen stain in the panties.
Now, and then certainly you indicate some of the other items that are now available to go back and,
Yep.
and whatnot. Is there any other analysis done on that report?
No, there's not.
And again, that exhibit, is that any different than the original report you prepared or provided to investigators?
No, it appears just as I provided it.
Your Honor, I move for the admission of People's 234.
Saved.
Okay, I'm handing you now, it's been labeled or marked as People's Exhibit 235. Is that a report you offered in this particular investigation?
Yes, People's Exhibit 235 is a copy of the report that I issued. This is laboratory number GR16-2492. It is record number 17. It would be the 17th report from the laboratory. It is a serology type of report, so again, we're back to that initial biological screening that is done on evidence. However, specifically for this report,
Can I have that?
definitely.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Now, I think you're indicating this record 17 is the serology report, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, I'm not going to have you go through all the things that you've already went through, but was there something added, something new that you did serology?
So primarily this report documents that some of the original evidence that was processed under record number 4 was resubmitted to the laboratory. A few additional requests on some very specific items from within this item. And then additionally, there is, along with that, there is one new item that has not been in the laboratory yet at this point, and it would be a reference buccal swab collection kit from Michelle Schnatala. Again, that's an additional reference that was indicated. It might have some bearing in this. So that was cut and prepared for DNA analysis.
Now, under this record, just so that I guess I'm clear. So we have the container number 4, which I believe was the black metal toolbox and everything that was located inside of that. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. Then you received a envelope with 2 black Adidas gloves. Is that?
That is correct.
And the known reference sample of Michelle Smitell.
That's correct.
All right. Did you do? I guess for the serology part of this, did you do any other work besides preparing Michelle's known swab or anything of that?
Yeah. So on this go round of evidence, there was 3 very specific requests, and that's what's the full inventory of what was submitted is on page 1 and the top of page 2. The very specific requests, though, were on the bulk of page 2. Specifically, item L6, the 2 black Reebok gloves. Specifically, item L17, that single black Mizuno right glove. And then finally, L37, the 2 black Adidas gloves. Based on some investigative information, there was some focus on a possibility of these gloves being used. And so it was specifically requested that I swab the exterior, before I had swabbed the interior surface of each. Now the specific focus was on the exterior surface of each of those gloves. So those 3 items were selected from that toolbox. They were, the exterior of each of those items was swabbed and forwarded for DNA analysis. So that adds 3 additional DNA samples, along with the reference sample from Michelle Shantala. That was also prepared and forwarded for DNA analysis.
And Mr. Hayhurst, as it relates to the gloves, and I know you kind of, when we were going through that list before lunch, you kind of were talking about either finding presence or not finding presence of blood. And so for the Mizuno gloves, were you able to find any stains of noteworthiness that you wanted to go back and take a look at?
For the Mizuno gloves, if there were stains, they were negative. So hang on one sec. I can infer. The Mizuno glove did have a discoloration that I tested. However, when I tested it, the chemical test did not indicate the presence of blood. So at that point, that ceased my interest in those gloves. Now, based on their new information, I went back and swabbed the exterior of that Mizuno glove. But again, the idea here being that potential for contact type DNA from the exterior surface of that glove.
And similar to the Adidas gloves, did you find any things that were of interest to you?
For the Adidas gloves, item L37 specifically, the bright light examination did not reveal any areas of discoloration, and so there was actually no chemical testing that took place on those gloves. Again, this second time around, it was strictly for the idea of a contact type sample from the exterior surface of those Adidas gloves.
And finally, the Reebok gloves.
The Reebok gloves, item L6, this was the glove initially tested, had a couple areas of discoloration. The initial chemical test indicated the possible presence of blood, but I followed up with the hemotrace test, which is specific for human blood, and that was negative. Now, one of the drawbacks to that test is you need more sampling than the other chemical tests, so it uses a little bit more. It's possible when I sampled that before that I maybe didn't get enough sample to get a good reliable test. The test performed as it should. The controls functioned adequately, so it was declared as a negative test initially. However, it's possible that there was staining present on that glove or some other bodily fluid on that glove that by swabbing the exterior this time, that could give some kind of a DNA result. So the exterior of the Reebok gloves was swabbed and forwarded for DNA analysis.
Okay. And essentially, is that, as you indicated, it was the 3 different gloves and the known of Michelle Smitell. That's what this report reflects you did.
That is correct.
Anything about this report different than the original you submitted?
No, it appears to be complete.
All right, I move for the admission of People's 235.
Receive.
Okay. This is People's Exhibit 236. record 18. What are we looking at in this particular record?
Yeah, so People's Exhibit 236 is a copy of another DNA laboratory report that I issued on this matter. Laboratory number GR16-2492, record number 18. And this is the second large grouping of DNA samples that were forwarded for DNA analysis.
Now, did you add some additional reference samples to this particular round?
That is correct. At the time this report was authored and these results were done, the comparisons were made, there were some additional DNA profiles that were available. Similar to previous, I didn't actually handle all of these. All I did was to go back and grab that electronic data from other records that were published by the laboratory. So at this point, on page 1 in the evidence inventory section, I had available to me a DNA profile from Jessica Herringa, which I believe, hang on. Yeah, so at the time of this report, that is now the more complete DNA profile for Jessica Herringa. In between the two DNA reports, I had reprocessed her DNA profile, and now I have the full complement of data at all of the 24 locations we use. So DNA profile from Jessica Herringa, DNA profile from Rebecca Blech, DNA profile from MJN, DNA profile from Jeffrey Willis, DNA profile from Kevin Bloom, and a DNA profile from Charlene Ann Willis. All of those were done in different laboratory records. Also, currently in this report, I obtained a DNA profile from Michelle Schnatala, and that is also now available for comparison. So I have 7 known samples that can be compared against all of the evidence from previous, but then all of the new evidentiary samples that are original to this report.
All right. So let's go through, and I guess going down the swabs of the passenger side door handle and the leather strap. Is this similar to what this is stuff that you had already done, and now you're adding this on to this report?
So the next series of evidentiary items are actually, this is the first time they've been processed for DNA. So that before we did not elect to process the passenger side interior door handle. Currently we did. So this is the report where I actually obtained DNA profiles from that sample. I obtained some usable DNA for comparisons from the leather straps on the ball gag. Previously we just did the ball, now the leather straps. Item L14 is the swab of that interior edge of the handcuffs. L26A is a swab of one of the syringe needles that was actually loaded, had some liquid in it still. L38B, this is now when I'm getting DNA analysis from the swab of the grip and trigger of the handgun. So before we had just done the muzzle stains. The knife blade, and then the 3 sets of gloves, the swab of the exterior of the Reebok glove, the swab of the exterior of the Mizuno glove, and the swab of the exterior of the Adidas glove. Those are all new pieces to this report. And then that next section is the listing of evidence that was actually analyzed previously and reported in record number 8. But because there's new knowns to be compared, those knowns will actually be compared currently. And then the bottom section on page 2 is the kind of the ongoing list of all those other samples that I took. I swabbed from items, but they still have not actually gone through DNA analysis at this point. They are items that we've not elected to profile at this point in the investigations.
Okay. So let's go through what you did here. Let's start with item L2X, which is the swab of the passenger side interior door handle.
Item GR16-2492-L2X, the swab of the interior passenger side interior door handle. That was a partial DNA profile, so it was something less than the full complement of locations. It did indicate to be a mixture of at least 3 donors, so that increases the complexity and the limitations on how I can interpret on something like that. And actually, because of the limited amount of data that was obtained, it was just low enough data, there was partial enough, really no conclusions can be made. This isn't a candidate for me to do any major-minor type of a comparison, and it's also not a good candidate for our statistical modeling program. So this is just an inconclusive sample.
Okay. Next is L8 BX, the swab of the leather straps.
Yeah, so item GR16 2492-L8BX, swab of those leather straps in the ball gag, was a partial profile, something less than the full complement of DNA types. And it also gave indications of being a mixture. Again, it was a mixture of two individuals. This was an instance where there was a major DNA profile that was declared. I documented major DNA types at each of the locations and then compared against all of the knowns that are available as of the time of this report. The DNA from Jeffrey Willis, the DNA profile from Jeffrey Willis, matches the major donor to the swab of that leather straps in the ball gag. Again, because there's an association, there's a statistic. It's number 1. The probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the population who also matches that major DNA profile from the swab of the leather straps would be 1 in 2.290 trillion in a Caucasian population, 1 in 10.20 trillion in an African American population, 1 in 7.062 trillion in a Hispanic population. Additionally, the other reference samples, Kevin Bloom, Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, Charlene Ann Willis, Michelle Schnatala, each of those individuals are excluded as being the major donor from the swabs in the leather straps in the ball gag. And then again, this is an instance where that minor DNA types were present in such low levels that they are insufficient for any kind of a comparison.
Okay, now the interior edge of the handcuffs, which is item L114AX. What did you find there?
Yeah, item GR16 2492L14AX, the swab of the interior edge of the handcuffs. It was consistent with being a single source DNA profile from a male contributor. That male DNA profile was compared against all of the knowns that were available. DNA profile from that interior edge of the handcuffs matches the DNA profile from Jeffrey Willis. Statistic number 2 on page 9. Probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the population who also matches that DNA profile would be 1 in 283.0 sextillion in a Caucasian population, 1 in 220.6 septillion in an African American population, and 1 in 6.135 septillion in a Hispanic population. Additional comparisons to other knowns. Each of the other individuals was excluded as being possible donors to that DNA profile from that male contributor. So that would be Kevin Bloom, Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, Charlene Ann Willis, and Michelle Schnatala are all excluded as being possible donors.
Okay, next is your swab of that loaded syringe.
Yeah, so item GR16-2492-L26AX, swab of the loaded syringe needle. It is consistent with being a single source, a male DNA profile. That male DNA profile would be from an unknown male donor, number 1. It's a partial DNA profile, so it's, again, a little bit less than the full complement. And it would be a good profile for comparisons. However, at the time of this writing, each of the DNA profiles that I obtained or had data for, each of those individuals was excluded as being a possible donor to that male DNA type.
So even Mr. Willis is excluded on that one?
That is correct.
But so is Kevin Bloom and Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, Charlene Willis, and Michelle Schnatala.
That's correct, and MJN.
And MJN.
Yes, that's correct. Each of those individuals is excluded.
All right. Next is L38BX, which was the swab work you did on the grip and trigger of that P22.
Yeah. So GR16-2492-L38BX, the swab of that grip and trigger. It was consistent with being a single source male profile, and that DNA profile matches the DNA profile from Jeffrey Willis. There's a statistic. Again, it would be that random match type statistic and the probability of selecting somebody else in the population who has that same DNA profile would be 1 in 6.124 septillion in a Caucasian population, 1 in 6.369 octillion in an African American population, 1 in 252.5 septillion in a Hispanic population.
And comparing, let me just get there here real quick.
Yep.
Comparing to the rest of the knowns that you had.
Yes, for the swab of the .22 handgun grip and trigger, each of the other individuals is excluded as being a possible contributor to that male DNA profile from the grip trigger of the gun. So Kevin Bloom, Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, Charlene Ann Willis, Michelle Shantala are all excluded as being possible contributors to that DNA profile.
Swab of this L39BX knife blade.
Swab of the knife blade gave a partial DNA profile. It was a mixture of two donors. Because it was so little data that was obtained from that sample, no conclusions can be made. It's just an inconclusive sample.
The next is L6X, a swab of the Reebok glove exterior.
So GR16-2492-L6X. Again, that's the swab of the exterior of the Reebok gloves. On that item, I obtained a mixture. It was a mixture of multiple contributors, and it was a mixture that was such that I felt that it would be better handled by the statistical modeling and the computer modeling for pulling apart different donors. And so that data was actually provided to forensic scientist Michelle Schmidt, and she will have conclusions on that item.
All right. Next is L17X, the swab of the exterior of the Mizuno glove.
GR16-2492-L17X is that swab of the Mizuno glove exterior. It was consistent with a mixture of 3 individuals, and this is an instance where there was one of those donors was a major, so I was able to document a major profile. When I compared that major profile against the references, Jeffrey Willis matches the major donor to the swab of the Mizuno glove exterior. It's statistic number 4. There we go. On page 9, again, the probability of selecting an unrelated individual from population who also matches that exterior of that Mizuno glove would be 1 in 473.7 sextillion in Caucasian population, 1 in 343.9 septillion in African American population, and 1 in 13.53 septillion in a Hispanic population. Additionally, comparisons were made against all of the other reference samples, and all of the individuals were excluded. That would include Kevin Bloom was excluded, Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, Charlene Ann Willis, and Michelle Shantala are all excluded as being that major donor. And then likewise, the minor donors that are present in that Mizuno glove, as we've seen previously, those minor donors are in such low amounts that there's no way to make a reliable comparison. They're insufficient for comparison purposes.
All right. I haven't. Do you need a glass of water or anything?
So that might be kind of nice.
Okay, we're doing a lot of talking.
Sorry.
I apologize. So as you are on L37, I'll pour you one.
Okay.
What are we looking at L? Excuse me, item number L-37.
37X. Okay, so GR16-2492-L37X is the swab of the exterior of the Adidas gloves. This underwent normal DNA analysis processing, and it was consistent with being a mixture of 2 individuals. Again, this is an instance, an instance where I was able to determine a major DNA profile, and that DNA profile from the major donor was used for comparisons. When comparing, Jeffrey Willis matches the major DNA profile from the swab of the Adidas gloves exterior. There's a statistic, that's number 5 on page 9, the very bottom. Probability of selecting another individual from the population who also matches that major DNA profile will be 1 in 783.1 septillion in a Caucasian population, 1 in 2.932 non-alien in an African American population, and 1 in 52.66 octillion in a Hispanic population. Additionally, that swab of the exterior of the Adidas gloves, item L37X, was compared against the other reference samples that are available in this case. Each of those individuals is excluded as being a major donor. Kevin Bloom is excluded, Jessica Herringa is excluded, Rebecca Blech, MJN, Charlene Ann Willis, and Michelle Shantala are all excluded as being that major donor. And again, this is an instance where the minor donor is low enough that I can't make any kind of a reliable conclusion for that minor donor that is present in the swab of the Adidas gloves.
All right. Now, this next one, L1X, the swab of the passenger side manual door lock. What did you do for this one?
Yeah, so item TR16-2492-L1X, swab of the manual passenger side manual door lock. This is the first of the items that was actually DNA profiled previously in the previous DNA report. It's present in this report because in this report I'm actually doing the comparisons to those new reference samples that I didn't have available to me prior. And so the DNA results are the same. It's still a mixture. It's still a mixture of multiple contributors. And it's still an item that actually has comparisons done in another DNA report by Miss Michelle Schmidt because of the computer modeling program that she used. However, at this time I can also say that Kevin Bloom is excluded as being a possible contributor to that door lock. Jessica Herringa is excluded. Rebecca Blech, Charlene Ann Willis, and Michelle Schnatala are all excluded as being possible contributors to that door lock from the van.
And then you did a redo on the red ball gag, is that for the red ball of the ball gag? And that's L8AX.
That's correct. L8AX is the same DNA that was run previously in the previous report. I have additional knowns that I can compare. That partial DNA profile still matches to the DNA profile from Jeffrey Willis, and the statistic is actually still the same. That statistic has not changed. But now I can also add that Kevin Bloom, Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, Charlene Ann Willis, and Michelle Schnatala are all excluded as being possible contributors to that red ball from the ball gag.
All right. Now we're at the swab of the end of the dildo/vibrator, which is L10A.
That's correct. So again, this is an item that was analyzed previously and results were reported previously. This is an item that I turned the data over to forensic scientist Schmidt so that she could do the computer modeling. And so she's actually reported that in record number 15 and then record number 19. And this is an instance where her report will have to reflect all of the comparisons to all of the various parties. It was complicated enough that I could not automatically exclude all of the new reference samples that were obtained. So all of the conclusions will be contained in her report.
All right. L11AX, which is the swab of the silver end of the vibrator.
Yeah, item GR16-2492-L11AX. This is again an item that was analyzed previously. Now I have additional reference samples that are available for comparison. Previously, this was identified to be a mixture of two individuals, at least one male contributor. There was a major DNA profile that I was able to obtain previously, and it was an unidentified profile. Now this major DNA profile actually can be determined to be a match to the DNA profile from Charlene Ann Willis. Again, because there's a match between the evidence and a known, there's a statistic. It's number 7 on page 10. Probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random who also matches that major DNA profile from the swab of the silver end of the vibrator is 1 in 9.2 million in a Caucasian population, 1 in 79.24 million in the African American population, and 1 in 13.41 million in a Hispanic population. Again, additional comparisons can be made to the other reference samples. As far as that major donor goes from the swab of the silver end of the vibrator, I can exclude Jeffrey Willis, Kevin Bloom, Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, and Michelle Schnatala. They're all excluded as being a possible contributor to that major DNA profile from the swab of the silver end of the vibrator. And then again, the minor donor is still insufficient for comparisons.
Your additional work on the interior of those leather restraints, which is item number L18AX, what did you find there as the new reference sample?
So again, L18AX, that interior of the leather restraints, is an item that was run previously. The major donor was previously identified as matching to Jeffrey Willis, and that statistic is the same statistic that was reported previously, so I won't repeat it now. But additionally, now I can say that Kevin Bloom Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, Charlene Ann Willis, and Michelle Schnatala. They're all excluded as being the major donor to that DNA profile from the interior of the leather restraints that were submitted. And then still, the minor donor is insufficient for any kind of a comparison.
Again, the further work on, this is L38AX, the stain on the end, the muzzle end of the 22 handgun with the additional known.
Yeah, I guess very similar to the previous item. It was already previously analyzed. Major donor already has been matched to Jeffrey Willis, and the statistic has not changed. But now I can add that Kevin Bloom, Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, Charlene Ann Willis, and Michelle Schnatala are all excluded as being that major donor on the stain on the end of the handgun. And again, the minor donor is still insufficient for comparisons.
All right. Your work on the new knowns to the interior swab of the 22 handgun slide.
Again, very similar to previous. The swab of the interior end of the surface of that slide of the 22 handgun is still a mixture, two individuals. There's a major DNA profile. That profile still matches to Jeffrey Willis, and this statistic has not changed. But now I can add that the exclusions, Kevin Bloom, Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, Charlene Ann Willis, Michelle Schnatala, they're all excluded as being a possible donor, or excluded as the major donor to that sample, and that minor donor is still insufficient for comparisons.
L43X, again, that's the swab of the van cargo area floor now with the new reference sample.
Yeah. So previously this was a sample that was complicated enough that I provided it to forensic scientist Schmidt so she could do the computer modeling. And that was actually reported in record number 15 that she produced. But now in looking at the new reference samples, I can also say that Kevin Bloom, Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, Charlene Ann Willis, Michelle Schnatala, they are all excluded as being donors to that mixture. And then again, further comparisons are within that record number 15 by Ms. Schmidt.
All right, the swab of the waistband of the red panties, which is item 4E1X, now with the new knowns. What can you tell us?
So item GR16-2492-4E1X, that's the swab of the red panties, the swab of that interior waistband. Again, looking for, try to see who potentially was wearing or handling these items. Still the same data, so it's still a mixture of at least two individuals. It's a mixture of DNA types. I know that at least one of them is a male contributor, but I don't know that there's necessarily a major or a minor. But when I'm comparing that mixture of DNA types, I can now say, in addition, I earlier said that Jeffrey Willis was included in that mixture of DNA types, but now the DNA types from Michelle Schnatala is also included as being a possible contributor to that overall mixture of DNA types from the swab of the waistband of the red panties. Again, this is a mixture statistic. It's number 12. And it's actually the same statistic that was represented previously. It's just now that we know one additional potential contributor to that mixture. And so actually statistic number 12, again, the probability of finding somebody else in the random population who also could be included in this mixture would be 930.2 thousand in a Caucasian population, 18.45 million African American, and 2.517 in a Hispanic population. So a little bit more information in that I can now include another individual in that mixture of DNA types.
And also, were you able to compare to the other knowns you had?
Yes, the other knowns that were available all were excluded from that mixture. So Kevin Bloom is excluded from that mixture of DNA types from that waistband of the red panties. Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, and Charlene Willis, they're all excluded as being potential contributors to that mixture of DNA types from the waistband of the red panties.
Now we're left on this report with your work on the pink panties at F1 and F2. So let's start with F1.
Yeah, so again, these items were run previously. The data has not changed. What has changed is now I have more references available. Previously on item F1, or the fraction 1 of that stain in the crotch of the pink panties, there was an unidentified female profile. Now I can say that that DNA profile matches the DNA profile from Michelle Schnatala. Previously that was unidentified, and now it was identified to her. There's a statistic that's involved. It's number 11. the top of page 11. And again, because that's a single source statistic, it's not a mixture of DNA types. It would be the probability of finding somebody else in the random population who also matches that DNA profile. It would be 1 in 3.621 non-alien in a Caucasian population, 1 in 932.8 non-alien in the African American population, and 1 in 38.02 non-alien in a Hispanic population. Again, excuse me, additional references were compared against that female profile from the stain in the crotch. And I can say that additional individuals are excluded. Jeffrey Willis is excluded, Kevin Bloom, Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, Charlene Willis. Each of those individuals are excluded as being a possible donor to that female DNA profile from that stain in the pink panties from the fraction 1. So that's the kind of everything else portion.
And finally, you work on F2.
So again, same sample. It's that pair of pink panties. It's that stain in the crotch. Item GR16-2492-4D2. It's fraction number 2. And this is an attempt at trying to get those sperm cells isolated. It's same DNA the profile that was produced previously. It's a mixture of 2 individuals. At least one of them is a male. And now I can look and say that the DNA types, the mixture of DNA types, Jeffrey Willis and Michelle Schnatala are both included as being possible contributors to that mixture of DNA types. Again, it's a mixture statistic, number 13. The last one, page 11. Probability of selecting somebody else from population who also would be included. 1 in 222.2 and 222.2 thousand in a Caucasian population, 102.8 thousand in an African American population, and 317.7 thousand in a Hispanic population. Additionally, the other reference samples were compared, and they are excluded. That would include Kevin Bloom, Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, Charlene Ann Willis. Each of those individuals is excluded from that mixture of DNA types that was obtained from the stain in the crotch of the pink panties.
Again, I'll ask you the question as it relates to this particular report, DNA report. Is there anything different in the original that you put together that's different in this exhibit?
No, this appears to be a fair and accurate copy of my report.
Your Honor, I move for the admission of People's Exhibit 236.
Please be seated.
Thank you, Judge. I think where we left off was People's 237, which is Record 22. And I showed this to you already, right, Mr. Johnson? Yes, you did. Okay. Is that a report that you authored, Mr. Hager?
People's Exhibit number 237 is a copy of a report that I authored in this case. GR16, the lab number is GR16-2492. The record number is number 22. And this is one of the initial screening serology type reports that was conducted on this.
Right. Before I ask any questions, I'm going to show Mr. Johnson another report. All right. I'm also going to hand you this is Record 25, People's Exhibit 238. What is that a report? I'm sorry, did you author that report? And what is it?
Yes, People's Exhibit 238 is a DNA report, laboratory number GR16-2492. It is record number 25, and it would correspond if record number 22, Exhibit 237, is the serology for another round of samples for potentially evaluating for DNA analysis. The samples that were selected from this serology report would then be reported in record number 25, which is People's Exhibit number 238. So the DNA actual testing results would be in this report. So they kind of go hand in hand.
And I'm not intending on going through the laundry list with you, but I do want to focus in on two things. But it references People's 238, the DNA report.
Yes.
In particular, in 237, I'm container number 33 and container container number 34.
Yes. So container 33 was a sealed paper bag. The exterior of the bag identified it as being 21 camera accessories and attachments. And then within the bag were a number of video camera batteries and other accessories such as lenses and filters and microphones and additional types of things you might have for a camera. Container 34 separately was a sealed paper bag. It was identified as having a green canvas bag, and contained within that was actually a green canvas bag that would be used. It would be the type of a bag that would be used to house video camera or accessories. So it would seem that those two items were together. They were packaged separately when I received them.
We had previous testimony that both those items, the bag and the accessories, were found in a shed located on the defendant's property. So keeping those two items in mind, flipping to the page, this would be page 4.
Correct.
What, if anything, did you do with item 14O and item 14P?
Again, item 14O was a number of different pieces of equipment. Again, of the different details, so that lenses and filters and such. Each of the items within that grouping of accessories was examined specifically for the presence of bloodstains. So again, bright light used to identify potential stains. Any stains that would be present would be tested using the same battery of tests. Again, the chemical test, the hemostix test, or the phenolphthalein test. And then if they did indicate the presence of blood, potentially get forwarded. And in all of the items that are contained within that batteries and accessories group, there was actually two separate camera batteries. One was a larger battery, one was a smaller battery. The larger battery had a small stain, and on the outside, on the back of the battery, and that stain indicated that the hemostix testing did indicate that it was positive, so it indicated the possible presence of blood. And the phenolphthalein testing was positive, so it also indicated the possible presence of blood. That sample was swabbed and forwarded for DNA analysis, which then gets reported in that later record.
14P?
For item 14P, again, that would be the green camera bag. There were a few areas of discoloration that were noted on the exterior surface of the bag, primarily on the bottom side, if I remember correctly. They were tested for blood. The phenolphthalein test was negative. It did not indicate the presence of blood, so those specific areas were not swabbed. However, I did take a swab of the shoulder pad strap, or like the carrying strap of this camera bag, and that swab was forwarded for DNA analysis. Those two items, the stain from 14O, that battery, and then the swab of the canvas, the green camera bag, that strap, those are the only two items that were carried forward from this serology report for DNA analysis.
Okay, you answered my next question. So, as it relates to the serology report, which is People's 237,
Correct.
is that a complete and accurate report of the serology you did on all those items, in particular 14O and 14P?
The only thing I know on both 237 and 238 in the upper corner, there's some handwritten notes. Those were not in the original. I believe they probably occurred after they were delivered to agency. But other than that, these exhibits do appear as I produce them.
Fair enough. As far as 237, I would offer that as People's Exhibit 237. All right, let's talk about 238 then on the two items. Give me 1 second here. Okay. Item 238, I think as you've indicated, you now have, again, all these known reference samples, and are you comparing them to the two swabs that you took off of the battery and off of the camera bag?
That is correct. As indicated on the screen, the evidence section of my report, two new evidentiary samples, stain on the camera battery, swab of the camera bag. Those are going to go through the DNA analysis process, and they will be compared against all of those known profiles that were previously developed.
All right, let's start with the camera battery.
So in the middle of page 2, the stain on the camera battery, item GR16-2492-14OX. I obtained a partial DNA profile from that stain on the camera battery. It was consistent with a male contributor, and I compared that against the reference samples that are available. The partial DNA profile from that stain on the camera battery matches the DNA profile from Jeffrey Willis. Again, because there's an association, there's a statistic. It's number 1 on page 3. It would be the probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the population who also would match that stain on the camera the stain on the camera battery. Excuse me. Would be 1 in 13.12 billion in a Caucasian population, 1 in 11.81 billion in an African American population, and 1 in 35.01 billion in a Hispanic population.
Right. Did you compare that then to the other knowns that you had?
Yes, all of the other knowns that were available for comparisons to this item were excluded. So that would include Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, Kevin Bloom, Michelle Snatala, and Charlene Ann Willis. Each of those individuals is excluded as being possible donors to that stain on the camera battery.
And then item 14PX, the swab of the camera bag itself.
Yeah. So DNA results from this item did indicate the presence of a mixture of 2 individuals, including a major male contributor. So after I was able to establish that major male DNA profile, I made comparisons. And Jeffrey Willis matches the major donor to the swab of the camera bag. Again, there's a statistic. It's number 2 on page 3. Again, it would be the probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the population who also would match that major DNA profile from the swab of the camera bag. Is 1 in 4.737 quintillion in a Caucasian population, 1 in 236.6 quintillion in an African American population, and 1 in 81.3 quintillion in a Hispanic population.
And again, did you then go back and compare it to the other reference samples you had?
That's correct. The major donor then was compared against the other reference samples, and they were all excluded. Jessica Herringa, Rebecca Blech, MJN, Kevin Bloom, Michelle Snatala, and Charlene Ann Willis. Each of those individuals is excluded as being the major donor for the swab of that camera bag. And then again, this is an instance where the minor donor types that were present are low enough that they are insufficient for any kind of a comparison.
And this particular report, People's Exhibit 238, I know you made reference to some handwriting on it, but outside of that, is there anything different than the original?
No, there's not. It appears as I produced it.
I would move to admit People's 238.
Objection received.
Just one other quick question, and I will be done with you, Mr. Hayhurst. Thank you for your time. Obviously, in this particular investigation, there was all classified as a boatload of evidence, and determinations were made as to what to test, what not to test. I mean, is there MSP policy? What governs that?
Yeah, so one of the things that has been around for a number of years, the Michigan State Police Forensic Science Division has policies in place that govern, that limit the number of samples that I am allowed to forward for DNA analysis. We would love to do every case sample for every case, but realistically speaking, with the number of people that we have statewide, we have to limit the number of samples. And so we actually have written policy that says that for a homicide type case, or a few other very select types of cases, we can send up to 7 evidentiary samples and then whatever knowns are associated. For all other case types, B&Es, other stuff, we limit it to 2 samples. Now obviously when we get to a case, cases such as this where we have multiple pieces of evidence, we have multiple individuals involved, we can work to get some leeway from this policy. But my supervisors will actually hold us pretty tightly to, let's start with the first 7, and we'll go through the DNA analysis process, and if we still need to do more, if there's more probative stuff, then we can have the investigators plead a case, make a case. This is why we need additional samples. So this is a case, I think initially, out of that toolbox, we swabbed a large number of items because I wanted to protect those DNA samples before I turned it over to our other units and protect the integrity of that evidence. But of the, I believe, 19 items that I originally swabbed from that toolbox, I limited it to, working with the investigators, we limited it to the first 11 evidentiary samples plus some knowns, and then came back and did more evidentiary samples. But it was really this attempt to try to stay as close to that 7 evidence items as possible.
And as you indicated, you work with investigators to try to narrow down what is it they feel is very important to make sure we get DNA off of, and what may not be quite as important, that priority list, if you will.
Yeah, that's correct. We try to help educate. Some of that is which items are most likely to give us DNA. So we might get some of the items that I initially swabbed. I don't have a very high hope that I'm going to get a lot of good DNA results, that are even good for comparison. So some of it is from a context of which are most likely to give us a result, but some of it's from a context from the investigative side of things where I don't necessarily know all the pieces. What is the most probative for your case to move forward? So that's very much kind of a back and forth conversation that we are having with them.
Thank you, Mr. Havers. I have no further questions, Judge.
Thank you.
Mr. Johnson, any questions?
Good afternoon, Mr. Hayhurst.
Good afternoon.
Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Hayhurst, yep.
Okay, you ready for another couple of hundred questions?
Sure.
All right. Let's start where Mr. Hilson left off. The policy is 7 submissions for DNA at any one shot. Is that correct?
Yeah, for the most part, we try to limit it to that 7 samples. Again, we will make exceptions, but that's what they hold our feet to the fire pretty good.
Okay. And just to state the obvious, it takes a lot of scientific equipment to evaluate DNA samples, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Expensive scientific equipment?
Yeah, there's both expensive equipment as far as instrumentation, but it's also some different steps in the process, expensive chemicals that will work in conjunction with that equipment. And then I also like to, we don't minimize the number of man hours that go into this. That can also be a large component of that mathematical equation as far as how much does it cost to run a DNA sample.
You anticipate my next question. There's a finite supply of experts like yourself, and there's a finite supply of equipment and materials. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's fair enough.
And all those factors go into limitations on how much DNA materials that you're suggested be submitted. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Okay. So what happens is, if there is a case where you need to have more stuff submitted, you have to make the case for it. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So if you make the case for it and you prove your point, I assume then the rule is bent and you're allowed to do what you need to do to prosecute a case.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Let's start a long time ago, so I'm going to go back. Let's see. Okay. And I'm going to apologize that this stuff is not well organized, but I'm going to ask you a couple things here. About the nature of DNA. I think you started there talking about what DNA is and how it gets distributed. I'm wondering, does all DNA last the same time? In other words, are there environmental factors that will go into determining whether or not a DNA submission, say on April 1st, will still be there as long as something's submitted on May 1st?
Yes, there's a variety of factors that go into play. And I guess I like to generally group them as both the ideas of quality and quantity.
Right.
Initially, I like to think about, for a DNA sample, the quality of DNA that's left behind. Obviously, if I have a large pool of blood on the ground or on the countertop, that's a very good wealth of information, or a lot of good DNA that can be used for analysis. If I would to compare that versus, say, a contact sample where somebody touches the counter a couple times, there's not a lot of DNA. So between those two items, the quantity becomes the first issue, and that obviously kind of becomes relevant to the specific types of evidence. The other portion of that is the quality of the evidence. I think that kind of speaks to what you're getting at, and that's the idea of how well preserved is that DNA. Samples that are collected, if it's collected and kept in a, maybe a neutral temperature environment, not too hot. I prefer it to be a little colder. Not super humid. Humidity will break down DNA. If it's sitting out in an environment like sunlight, the UV from light will actually break down the DNA fragments. High humidity. There's a number of different environmental type factors that will serve to break down DNA. If I started with 2 different quantities and I subject them to these environmental types of conditions, even a larger quantity type sample over time could potentially degrade. Now, typically, if we're dealing with something that's as strong as a blood stain, I'm still going to have enough left over. But if we're talking about something that didn't have a lot to begin with, those environmental conditions can seriously affect some of the recovery of DNA that's present.
All right, thank you. And in conjunction with that thought, it is possible, therefore, for two people to touch the exact same object and only one of them, or maybe even neither of them, leave a DNA sample.
Yeah, so there's different studies that are out there that talk about, specifically you're talking about touch, so again, those contact type samples. And studies are available that show that certain individuals are more prone to leaving DNA behind than others. If you had two individuals who touched an object with the exact same amount of time, they held it for 30 seconds and then they both put it down, we might expect to see one item have more DNA than another. Again, just because of the quantity of DNA that's left behind. Again, that there's no good way to quantify that and say, hey, you're a great person at leaving DNA behind and you're not. It has to do with how item is touched, how long it's touched, what kind of friction is present to leave skin cells behind. There's a lot of factors that go into that. But yeah, it's potentially possible to have two people touch an item, and I may not register a whole lot of DNA from one individual. I might see more from another. It can go either way.
And again, following the same line of logic, it also will make a difference how often one person touches the single object in the same location. For instance, a pair of gloves. If a person wears a pair of gloves every day, all winter long, and touches it all winter long, and there's with each touch, there's a possibility that he or she may leave another DNA sample. So cumulatively, you're going to have more and more the more you put this glove on. Is that a logical assumption?
Yeah, potentially that would be, again, more frequent contact increases that likelihood of leaving DNA behind. But again, you might talk about how likely is that person to leave it behind anyway. There's a lot of different factors that go into that.
Okay. And conversely, I've got a pair of gloves, and my brother forgot his, and I let him use mine today, and he's only going to use those gloves once. But because he has less frequent contact with those gloves, he may not leave the DNA sample, the quantity of DNA sample that I leave, because I wear those gloves every other day otherwise.
Yeah, that's potentially possible.
Okay. And on the subject of gloves, the decisions are made as to where the gloves are, the samples are taken, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you look for telltale signs as for areas that there might be DNA available or other evidence available. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And was that the situation in these gloves with the gloves? I think there were 5 gloves in all.
Yeah, so there were a pair of gloves, a single, and then another pair. Between those 5 gloves that were submitted, a variety of types of different decisions were made. Again, the easiest DNA profile would be if I were to locate a stain on any of those gloves, a seminal fluid stain or a blood stain. Each of those gloves I actually also did consider, because they had different logos and branding. I considered whether they might be a possibility for prints analysis. So, some of those types of judgment things come into it. But yeah, in the end, the interior of those gloves were swabbed, again, with the idea that that would be the most likely source of DNA from the gloves coming from the palm for whoever is wearing those gloves.
But the interior of the gloves weren't swabbed for all 5. They were just swabbed for the first 2, and then the other 3 were swabbed later. Is that correct?
The interior of the Reebok gloves were swabbed initially. That was L6. The interior of, excuse me if I can reference this. Hold on. Sorry. The interior of the Reebok gloves were swabbed initially. And I don't know that sample ever actually, it was not actually run for DNA, but we swabbed it to preserve it. I swabbed it to preserve it. The interior of the black Mizuno right glove, item L17, that was the single, that was also swabbed for DNA. The other pair of gloves, the Adidas pair, I did not actually swab the interior at that time just because of the analysis that was done at that time. But each of those swabs was collected. I just want to confirm, sorry.
Take your time.
L6, which is the interior of the Reebok gloves, that was not ever, the interior was never actually analyzed. And L17, that single Mizuno glove, also The swab was collected, but it was never actually analyzed. Each of those swabs remains in the tube inside the coin envelope, inside a larger envelope that was returned to the agency. So they were swabbed to preserve them, but based on, again, sample limitations on how many samples, neither of those samples was actually forwarded for DNA analysis.
So which of those were actually sampled and swabbed and analyzed interior?
The interior of those gloves, actually the interior of none of the gloves were actually analyzed for DNA analysis. Again, the Reebok ones, the interiors were swabbed, and the Mizuno interior was swabbed, but not actually run for DNA. The swabs that were from the gloves that were actually run, all three of those, the set of the Reebok, the single Mizuno, and the set of the Adidas gloves, the exterior of each of those was sampled for DNA, and those were reported in record number 18.
And they were all swabbed at the same location?
Yes, the exterior of the gloves concentrating on the fingers, both sides of the fingers, and then the palm or the fist area of the gloves. Primarily the entire exterior of each of those gloves separately. So the Reeboks were swabbed onto one, the Mizuno was swabbed onto one, and then the Adidas was swabbed onto one.
Okay. And you found these gloves, well, did you find those gloves, or were they located and then brought to your attention and then you made note of it?
So I was actually at the original scene where the toolbox was located and was opened. I actually was able to cut the lock. The Reebok gloves, the pair of Reebok gloves was contained within that toolbox together. And so they actually get inventoried even in the scene report that we has issued. The single right Mizuno glove was also within that large toolbox. The two black Adidas gloves were located in that separate container, which was the Sentry Safe lockbox. It's identified as item L27. Those two Adidas gloves, the black Adidas gloves, are L37. They were contained within that lockbox. So they were actually separate from the other two or the other three gloves that were present.
Okay, so we have the lockbox and we have the toolbox, correct?
That's correct.
And the lock was cut off of the toolbox in your presence?
That's correct. I actually used the bolt cutters to cut the lock on the toolbox.
Okay. Do you know how long that box was locked prior to your coming off again?
I do not. I know that the lock was intact when we found it and I removed it, but I do not know what its status was prior to that.
Was the lockbox inside the toolbox?
The lock box,
Was that under the seat?
if I can refer to my notes real quick. I didn't study the scene stuff as much here. Sorry. The Sentry Safe lockbox was located under the driver's side front seat. So it was in the van underneath the driver's side seat. And it was also closed when we located it. It was locked closed it has a lock on the front of it. That was pried open by Sergeant Flowers when we were at the scene. He was able to open that box so we could get access to it.
Thank you. Other than the lockbox then, and the toolbox, was there any structure separating the objects that you found from each other? And I understand well, maybe I don't understand. I'm incorrect. Was there any structure separating the objects you found inside the toolbox, for instance, from each other? Were there compartments, were there plastic boxes, or anything along those lines?
Within the toolbox was a smaller black lockbox.
Okay. And
within that, and it was not, I don't believe it was locked. Within that were items, that was item L25. There was L25A, which was two sets of nitrile gloves, and then a ammunition box of some 22 rounds. That box within that, so it was a box within that container. But otherwise, all of the other items that we've identified as L5 through L24, 25, that lockbox, were all contained within that toolbox. We recovered them all within the toolbox. We inventoried them on scene. They were returned to that toolbox and brought back to the laboratory in that condition.
Okay. Within the toolbox, then these stuff, did the objects you find appear to be carefully organized and located, or did they look like something that maybe they just like my toolbox, so just stuff thrown in there.
Yeah, they were, the items within the toolbox were definitely commingled. Typically when we're at a crime scene, I will collect items and each item goes into its own container. In this instance, when we recovered the toolbox and all of the items within, they were already all together. So we returned them to the laboratory. They processed through the laboratory in that same condition. They were already all in contact with each other. To do any kind of separation at that point made no sense as far as the logic of that evidence. Those items were already touching each other. More touching was not going to necessarily adversely affect that.
Do you know how long it was between the time Miss Blech was killed and this search was commenced?
I know that this search was in May of 2016. I believe the Blech matter has a 2014 lab number, but because I did no work on the Rebecca Blech case until after the search, I don't remember the exact time frame within 2014. So other than 2014 to May of 2016.
Okay. I think you know where I'm going. You're looking for DNA. All these things are commingled. What's your fear when you're looking at a bunch of materials and they're commingled like that for maybe as long as 2 years?
Yeah, anytime I'm processing evidence in the laboratory, we have very specific policies and procedures in place that will. We're always worried about cross-contamination for DNA because our stuff is so sensitive. So when I'm working in the laboratory, we only are allowed to have one item open on our bench at any given time. Having more than one item open and available, especially items if we have something that's particularly bloody and it flakes off or whatever, that does introduce the possibility of contaminating from one or the other. Yeah, if these items have been rolling around in this toolbox for some kind of a time frame, there is that possibility that items could transfer. I think I would probably have the biggest fear if we're talking about something that has a large quantity of DNA. If I'm dealing with some really bloody evidence, I'm much more paranoid than if I'm dealing with a bunch of evidence that's, say, more on the idea of like the touch DNA or contact DNA. But even with that, I have some concerns, and so I would work to caution against that.
Okay, so but it's not a point. Let's just talk about something else. You mentioned that on one of the vibrators, I much prefer that term, you found a human hair or a hair.
That's correct.
But there wasn't a follicle with it.
That's correct.
So you couldn't test it for DNA.
We couldn't test it for nuclear DNA.
Okay.
Yes.
Why wasn't the hair tested? Explain this.
Okay, so when we talk about forensic DNA analysis, you see it on TV. Most of the time, the DNA analysis you're hearing about, the DNA analysis that we all talked about here in court, was nuclear DNA analysis. And that is the more normal, standard DNA analysis. Nice, good, wealthy source of DNA that's present. It's a faster process. It's very robust. It's a good gold standard. There's another type of DNA analysis. There's actually several other types. So one of the other smaller fields of DNA analysis is mitochondrial DNA analysis. A lot of times we're talking about identifying bodies that have been old and degraded. If we're talking about hair type samples, that's where mitochondrial DNA will come into play. On a hair, if I were to have a hair, the root is where all of the growing nuclear material is present. And so if I find a hair on a piece of evidence, we will examine to see if that root is intact that might have the growing part of the hair or perhaps even the skin that was ripped out along with that, kind of around the root of that hair. If there is an intact root on a hair, we can snip the end of it and we can send that for regular standard DNA analysis. If that root and that skin tag is absent and all we have is a length of hair, then the only option we have is mitochondrial DNA. We at the Michigan State Police do not actually do mitochondrial DNA. We refer all of that work to the FBI, or there are several regional labs the FBI has set up. It's a much more labor and time intensive process. They don't look at the normal nuclear DNA that we're looking at. They look at the very small circles of DNA that are present within the mitochondria in the cells, and those are still intact on a hair, whereas a growing hair, a long hair, doesn't have any actively growing nuclear DNA, so we can't do that testing. So that item, such as that hair, as soon as that was recognized and there was no skin tag, no root ball on the end of it, it's no longer an option for us to do. it was disclosed in the report, and no further testing was done on that item.
Can you describe to the jury the hair? Length, color, curl, or lack thereof?
Flip back to my notes here.
All right.
We used to do more types of hair comparison type things, so my notes would have been more extensive. Over the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've much gone against doing any hair comparisons, and really it's that I necessarily even recognized. I couldn't tell you what it was from. It was with a, it was also in the same area as like a black straw that looked much like that coffee stir straw. All it was described as was an orange cap, and it had no stains on it, so it was not suitable for DNA. I did no further testing on that item.
You noticed during your direct, I'm speaking of the 22 caliber gun that you're working, that you tested that, and that you found on the barrel and when it's pulled back, you found stains. Is that how you phrased it? What are we talking? Was this a smudge, or what are we talking about?
So, again, commonly on guns, we come encounter with, some guns come in with an awful lot of stuff on them. It's not uncommon to encounter different types of oils for cleaning and stuff like that. So that's always kind of in the back of my head. As I was examining this with a bright light, I noticed an area of discoloration. And again, it was on that muzzle end of the gun, and then you take the slide back in and around that same area. It was a substance. It was foreign. It wasn't the metal from the gun. And so it was something that I had the potential to test. They did indicate... sorry. 22. Here we go. It did indicate, I used the hemostix test in this instance. It did give a positive result. It indicated the possible presence of a stain. Again, there are other things that there are some other things that can make that test turn positive. So that's why it's phrased as a possible presence of blood. And then typically I would like to follow that up with that secondary test that's much more specific for human blood. But again, in this instance, because I did not want to waste any of the sample trying to figure out whether it was human blood or not, let's just send it for DNA. If I get a DNA result, then there's a pretty good indication that it was some kind of a human fluid. So no further testing was done at the serology stage. I swabbed just that muzzle end as one item, pull back the slide and that stain around the barrel as a second item, and then the grip and trigger from that. So 3 separate samples from that weapon.
Until you put the bright light on that firearm, were you able to see these areas?
I honestly don't recall. Sorry.
In your business, I would imagine there's been occasions where people have, or persons have endeavored to remove evidence of DNA in various ways. Wiping stuff down, cleaning stuff off, that sort of thing.
For intended purposes, for cleaning. Okay, not for nefarious. I'm just making sure.
For nefarious purposes.
For nefarious purposes.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I've heard stories, I guess, of nobody that I'm aware of.
Assuming that someone might, well, you tell me, in your experience, if you're looking for DNA, are you trained to recognize where, hey, this thing's been wiped down or this thing's been cleaned off, that sort of thing?
We have some techniques that may show instance of that. For instance, I would say I've been to crime scenes where I can tell people have cleaned up. Blood stain on the floor, somebody's tried to clean it up. We have some chemical enhancement techniques that can show some of that. But as far as your normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill analysis, no, that's not something that we typically look for, and it's not something that we typically are looking to identify on evidence.
Was there anything about this particular toolbox that triggered a suspicion along those lines in your mind as you looked through it?
Nothing as I was examining it, no.
You mentioned a couple of the records were, I think the phrase used was resubmitted. What does that mean?
So specifically, we're talking in reference the toolbox and that smaller lockbox. They were originally submitted to the laboratory and reported. Actually, they were submitted to the laboratory by the crime scene crew. We brought it back from the van, and I submitted it to the laboratory for processing. Those items were processed for biology, for DNA. They went to prints, and then they went to firearms. And then after all of the initial laboratory examinations were done, those items were sealed up and returned to the agency. And I have a chain of custody that could show the dates that those traveled back to that agency. At some point in time, we had some additional questions. Again, we wanted to look at the outside of those gloves. So that toolbox specifically and that lockbox were resubmitted to the laboratory. And what that means is this is not new evidence that's coming into the lab for the first time. That would be just a normal new submission. Instead, this is evidence that's already been at the laboratory. It's coming back to the laboratory, being resubmitted for some additional analysis, some additional processing. So initially the evidence was reported in record number 4, and then that toolbox was resubmitted in record number 17. Again, I didn't go through and examine every single item in there, again, looking very specifically for the items of interest that we needed. But that would be what qualifies as a resubmission type of a item.
So the evidence doesn't physically leave your labs or go someplace else, and then, oh, by the way, and then they send it back?
It may have. I'd have to look at the chain for timing and stuff. It's entirely likely that it might have been returned to the agency. Again, as soon as it's leaving our laboratory, it goes back into that outer container. So in this case, the big paper bag that the toolbox was contained within. That paper bag goes to the agency, and then I trust when they resubmit it to the laboratory that it should still, all of the seals should still be intact. And that would, to me, indicate that there's still some integrity in that evidence and that is still protected, hasn't been available. Once it leaves the lab, I don't know what happens to it necessarily, but as long as that seal comes back and it's intact, then the integrity of that evidence is still intact.
And you may need your folder for this. The first time you tested the panties, the 2 sets of panties in this particular, was that was the record of that record 7? Was that the first time?
Yes, that's correct. The panties were first examined. The serology testing was in record number 7.
And I have the phraseology, MCSD PR number 58025. That's after Mr. Willis's name on the evidence?
That's correct.
What does that mean?
So we try to put as much identifying information on each item as we can. Many items as they're received already have we put our laboratory property sticker on, but many items as we receive them already have a property sticker from the investigating agency. To me, in this instance, you say MCSD PR, that would to me represent the Muskegon County Sheriff's Department, and it is their property room number, and then there's a specific number. Each of their items of evidence should have its own MCSD and then their property evidence tag. But that would be a fairly standard tag. Many of our agencies throughout the state use them. All of them might look a little different. The Muskegon County stuff probably looks a little different than the Norton Shore stuff, probably looks a little different than the Michigan State Police stuff. But most of the agencies in the area will use a property tag of some sort.
When you first began doing these evaluations, you had my client's name and 3 others. But at some point you were given Ms. Shinatolas, Mr. Bloom, and maybe some others. Is there a significance to you in that? What is the significance of getting more names checked?
Honestly, for known type samples, for reference type samples, we just ask the investigating agencies to bring us any type of a reference type sample for anybody who might be involved in the case. I've worked other cases where you might have people who are not even directly involved in the crime, but because they live in a home, they're roommates with somebody, or they're kids of somebody, we ask for children or parents, and in an attempt to try to identify any unidentified profiles that we find, I want to be able to see if we can put a name to it, even if we figure out after the fact that it's really not relevant to anything. So that's why we will request really commonly any samples, reference samples from all victims that might be in a crime, all suspects who might be involved in a crime, and then an elimination type samples, anybody who may have come in contact with it, different investigators who might have had in contact with it. We will ask for reference samples from as many people as we get.
Okay. Do you recall in record 18, were all those tests done with the fusion system?
Yes, by the point in time that I got to record number 18, the bulk of the evidence that we looked at today was all processed using the fusion system. The only holdover pieces of evidence were those initial pieces of evidence from that 2013 case with Jessica Herringa. Initially in Record 8, all I had was her profile from the PowerPlex 16 kit, so it's 16 locations. However, by the time record number 18 comes along, I had opportunity to reanalyze her profile using the current modern technology, and so I had a complete profile for Jessica Herringa, which means that all of the items in report number 18 that were analyzed using the PowerPlex fusion system.
Did you do that for all of your work? Did you go back and redo it on the fusion, or just specific individuals or specific circumstances?
For the reference samples that I analyzed, the only reference sample that was not done in fusion originally would have been Jessica and the parental samples that I used to confirm the alternate reference. All of the other samples, Rebecca Blech, I never actually handled that sample. That was run by somebody else in fusion. MJN, I ran using the fusion system. Michelle Shantala was run using the fusion system. Jeffrey Willis, Kevin Bloom, Charlene Willis, all of these were samples that were analyzed initially using the PowerPlex fusion system. That kit came on board several years ago. I don't remember the exact date on that, but that kit has been in use now for several years as of current, and so most of the evidence in this case was analyzed using that current technology.
There's some portions of your report, and the words previous record number 27 or 15, for example, does that mean that somebody else did the DNA work up there, or what's that phrase referring to?
So I have in front of me record number 18, People's Exhibit 236. Initially, I like to list all of the different reference samples that I have available at this time, and so you can see on this specific record which ones are present, and then if it's not something I did currently, if it's something I did currently in the lab, I'll list. But if it's not something that I've done currently, it's a reference that the previously analyzed is a reference for you or for anyone to go back and see where was that specific result originally reported. So Rebecca Blech, that DNA profile was previously analyzed in lab number GR143508, record number 27. That is not a record that I specifically authored. Someone else in the laboratory authored it. But if you wanted to go find that DNA profile, that's where I got it from. That's the record. That's where I got that electronic data from.
You did the search in May of 2016, but there was a glove, the Reebok glove, wasn't tested until September 2016. Is that accurate? And if so, do you know why there was a time lag between discovery and review?
Yeah, so timing on that specific item, again, if I can refer to my notes. The van was processed in May of 2016. On the 17th, we took all that evidence back to the laboratory. Actually, on the 18th, the following morning, I came in at 5 in the morning to initially start working through some of the stuff in that toolbox. Went out and did a second crime scene on the 18th after that early morning session. But over the next few days, the 20th, 21st, 23rd, is when that evidence was initially processed. Samples were taken, and it went on to a DNA batch on the 25th of May is when that batch started. So pretty quickly after receiving that stuff, I took that first round of DNA into the lab. There was some time frame. I made a report. It went through review. It was issued to the agency. And at that point, additional samples were requested, and that's when that kit, that toolbox, was resubmitted to laboratory. That actually came back into the laboratory in the middle of July of 2016. I did not, it sat in the vault for a couple weeks. I was actually on some vacation during July of 2016.
What?
It was a really nice vacation. I did not have a chance to pull that out until my next, between other DNA batches and other commitments. I actually pulled that back out of the vault, our secured vault, in August of 2016. And that's when those exterior of the gloves were swabbed and prepared for DNA. And then again, it went into a DNA batch at that point. So there is some time frame lag from when it was first analyzed in May to that second kind of group of analysis was in August of 2016. And then the last most recent reports were in even May of 2017 for the camera bag. So several different time frames and some gaps. Again, that's based on scheduling, it's based on availability, it's based on who's doing what DNA batches. This case was kind of assigned to me, so I just didn't have a chance to get to it yet.
So there was some swabbing done after the initial discovery of this material, is that correct? Went back and re-swabbed the exterior of the gloves?
There was swabbing that were done initially upon screening it, and then re-swabbing after that, yes.
Okay. But by the time it was well, where had the gloves been all this time?
Yeah, so we'll have a chain of custody that tracks where it's at. The gloves were in my custody, and then they would have traveled to our latent print examiner.
Okay, that's not what I meant. Physically, were the gloves separated from the plastic bags, or were they left in that toolbox?
No, the gloves were still in the toolbox during that time frame.
And I assume that the toolbox wasn't kept on somebody's porch, it was kept in your lab under controlled conditions, correct?
That's correct.
But does your lab prevent, say, evaporation, dehydration of materials that's inside? Is it a climate-controlled lab that makes sure that everything gets preserved, or is it
Yeah.
a dark, big room?
Yeah, it's the best of our ability. We try to maintain our lab in a normal working environment. Again, that's going to be best for the different procedures for all of the different units. So in addition to being able to track the chain of custody as far as who had custody of an item, when other analysts in the laboratory had custody of that item, their custody would have been reflected within their normal workspaces. Again, there was a period of time when my latent print analyst had that toolbox, and then there was a period of time when it traveled to our firearms unit for some of the items in there. So each of those is, potentially a new environment, but we try to keep it at a pretty constant, low humidity. It's always dry in our laboratory, low humidity type environment.
Okay. But you received the A method is what you do at the site, where you take that thing, you give the swab, and you put that thing in a sealed envelope so it doesn't mix with the air or anything else. There's a reason you do that, because it's the best method of preserving the materials, is it not?
Yeah, that's probably the preferred method, yeah.
Can you pull record number 8? Because I have a question about that real quick, if you have it.
Record number 8.
All right, thank you. In your results section, you mentioned 2 different systems were used in examination. No, record number 8. Record number 8 is
234.
234.
Okay, well, that's what I'm saying, we should refer to it by the exhibit.
Thank you, John. I'll make the effort. Exhibit 234.
Yes, People's Exhibit number 234, yes.
In that particular record, it mentions that there are 2 different systems used for examination. Why is there a distinction made there?
Again, at the time that my record number 8, People's Exhibit 234, was issued, that's kind of that first large round of DNA testing. And at the time that was done, that's when I ran the reference samples from Jeffrey Willis and MJN. I borrowed the data that was previously obtained from Jessica Herringa and data from the Rebecca Blech for their reference samples. Now, at that time, each of those samples was still in the older kit chemistry. So both of those, the note on here says that DNA recovered from GR13-25591GX, that would be Jessica Herringa's alternate reference, and GR14-3508-4D1X, that would be the Rebecca Blech known sample. Both of those items they were previously processed using the older PowerPlex 16 system. So at that time, those had not been redone in the new technology. By the time record number 18 is out, both of those samples were processed using the newer, updated technology, so we have a more complete picture. But at the time that this report was issued, I just had the more limited profile.
Thank you. I'm almost done. The major and the minor donors. On some occasions, the minor donor is so minor you can't come to any conclusions as to who that person was. Sometimes not even their gender.
So yes and no. We have one location. It's amylogenin, and it is a sex amylogenin. Each of the locations we look at has in a sense, an address. D3S1358. It's a specific address on the DNA that we're looking at. When it comes to sex typing, we look at amylogenin is the location, and it is a location where there is either one or two peaks. It's an X peak or an XY, and that would indicate to us a male or a female. On some of the mixtures, I can see that there's two peaks present, but I don't necessarily know that this is two males or a male and a woman. I just know that at least one of them is a male because I can see the Y peak present. On other samples, I just see the X, so I know that that could only be from a female. It's not likely to have the Y dropout. So some of the mixtures, it's more clear than others if the major is a male or a female, and it all depends on those levels of the peaks at that amylogenin location.
And so, what we do know with the minor is we do know these are human beings, correct? We're not getting animal DNA confused with maybe.
Yeah, animal DNA does not typically show up in this kit. It is pretty specific for human DNA, and if there is any animal DNA that were to amplify, it does not look like anything normal. We occasionally see some nasty samples that will have weird peaks. That was not the case in any of these instances.
So when I'm looking at this, my conclusion is, and tell me if I got it right, that this is either, that this minor DNA is either bits and pieces of DNA that's insufficient to attach to the people who you know the DNA is from, or from somebody that's not even been reviewed, not even on your list. Am I correct? It's either one or the other, right? It's from the people you know it's from, or it's from somebody else that may not be on your list.
I guess I would characterize it slightly different. I can tell it's a mixture because I see that there are peaks that are present. So I see my two major peaks, and I see something else going on. So I know that there's additional DNA present there. But whether it's male or female, I may not know. Whether it's even a complete picture. If I see two peaks and one little one, is that one little one because I only see one peak from that person, or did I lose an extra peak? Those minor donor types are low enough that I'm not able to make any good comparisons because it's not as reliable or reproducible. We may see where they get preferential identification, different artifacts that might take place. Basically, it's just limited enough that we do not make any, by policy, we don't make any good comparisons to data that is that low. If that minor donor type was higher, I might be able to make some comparisons to it. If it's high enough, it goes over certain thresholds that we've established. Or if it's, again, closer to an instance where we see the peaks are more in line with each other, then that might be an instance where using this computer modeling program would be a good situation. But on the majority of the mixtures that I referenced where we were talking about a minor donor is insufficient, that typically means that I can see extra peaks are there, but they're low enough, they're not reliable and reproducible to make any good comparisons on.
Thank you. Can you locate record number 2 and tell me what exhibit number that is?
People's Exhibit 226 is GR 13-2559, record number 2, the Jessica Herringa.
That's correct.
Okay. Yes.
If you turn to page 2 for me.
Yes.
And let me show you specifically. You see there's a sentence there that's telling me that we've got some inconclusive results due to degraded DNA, insufficient or degraded DNA. Can you expand, and whose is it DNA are we talking about? Or don't we know?
So specifically we're looking in the middle of page 2 on People's Exhibit number 226. It is lab number GR 13-2559, record number 2. This would be the initial DNA results from the Jessica Herringa matter. One of the items that was swabbed and forwarded for DNA analysis was a small battery cover. It was identified to me as a swab of a Carl Walther /ULM battery cover, which I understood to be a cover from a battery component. Initially, that DNA sample was analyzed back in 2013 using, again, initially our older kit, our PowerPlex 16 Hot Start kit. And I was able to get a mixture. I could tell that it was a mixture of DNA, but it was a very low amount of DNA. The peaks that were there, because they were not a single source, it was a mixture, and because they were at a level that was low enough, we have certain thresholds that we have in place, a stochastic threshold, an analytical threshold, And these are levels where we like to see data is higher than these levels because we know that it's reproducible. We're not seeing different types of artifacts show up. This sample was analyzed originally using this PowerPlex 16 hot start kit, and at this time was reported as being inconclusive results. It was a mixture. It was low enough that I didn't feel that it was something we could make a reliable comparison to any knowns. So at that point in time, there were no comparisons. It was inconclusive due to insufficient and/or degraded DNA, and I think both of those are appropriate. And no comparisons were made on that item at that time.
Thank
Yeah, just a couple follow-up, Your Honor. I want to start there and work backwards. Was that sample then forwarded on and later examined using the StarMix system?
Yeah, so that specific sample back in 2013 was analyzed using the older technology. I got the results I did. I actually dried down on DNA samples like that where we have liquid DNA. I dried that down. It becomes a dehydrated sample. It was returned to the agency. And then at a later date in some of the investigations, we looked back and realized, there was a decent quantity of DNA in that sample. Using the older kit, I got results that I kind of would expect. The newer generation going into the fusion technology is actually quite a bit more sensitive. It's kind of scary how much better it is at getting good DNA profiles. So at a later date, and I could look up the date, at a later date I actually requested that sample to come back to the laboratory. It was dried down in the tube. It was still intact in the coin envelopes and the envelopes. It was submitted to the laboratory, and I brought that sample back up in liquid. We have a rehydration process. It was brought back up into a liquid form, and then it was pushed through the DNA analysis process using the current fusion chemistry, and then was made available for some comparisons.
And I cannot remember. I don't think you did those comparisons. I think did do those comparisons?
So yeah, initially I did the actual DNA analysis. I got to the point where I recognized this is a mixture. It's a mixture that might have some value to it. It was not a mixture where there was necessarily major or minor types. And so based on my understanding of that software, that is a sample that was pushed to forensic scientist Michelle Schmidt so that she could do some comparisons and see if there's any type of a conclusion that can be made from that. So we did get better results that time around. We got a more complete DNA profile. It still wasn't a full single source profile like I'd expect from a nice blood stain or something. But we did get more data that second time around that then she was able to make some comparisons for.
She's testifying tomorrow, so I'll talk to her about that.
Yes.
A couple of redirects here.
Yeah.
I'm going to start generally. And we've had some of your colleagues testify to this, but I want your take on this as well. It is possible for DNA to be preserved over time. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I mean, essentially there are cold cases that go on throughout the nation that are sometimes 10, 15, 20 years old, and they're still able to analyze articles for DNA.
Yes, I've actually even personally worked on some of those cases where there are pieces of evidence from the 80s or earlier. Depending on how what the stain was that was originally deposited, depending on the storage conditions in that interim, as long as it was stored in your average property room with a average temperature, low humidity, stains are potentially stable for years and years.
And just so we're clear, there's a difference when we're talking about samples. There's a difference between a stain and a contact sample. Is that correct?
Yes. I have much more, by habit I tend to describe things as stains as things that actually have a body fluid that's identified. Blood, seminal fluid, saliva. Typically a stain to me is something that is likely to have a decent quantity of DNA being present. The other example you gave is this idea of a contact or a touch type sample. For instance, the gun that's sitting in front of me. There's a stain on that muzzle end, or some kind of I think is a stain on the muzzle end that I feel would be more stable. The grip and trigger, though, is more of a contact type sample. So again, kind of goes back to the idea of the quantity of DNA. A stain is more likely to have a better quantity to begin with, versus a contact sample is more likely to have less DNA present to begin with.
And just so we're clear, as you processed this vehicle, the handgun itself was not inside the toolbox.
No, it was not.
That was in a separate lockbox
That's correct.
under the driver's seat?
Under the driver's seat.
Okay. And when you processed the toolbox, did you find you had talked earlier about, when we talk about this commingling business, you're more worried about stuff that's where you've got let's say a pool of blood or a large quantity that might get mixed and jumbled. Did you find that inside that toolbox where you had some large quantity of DNA that might have got on the inside of the leather straps or the inside of the handcuffs?
Yeah, as kind of evidence with the report that I had, record number 4, People's Exhibit 231. A lot of visual examination, some initial testing, but really no large blood stains, no large pool of blood present. Potentially a lot of items in that toolbox would have been touched, could have been touched, may have been touched, but not in a sense that there's a lot of bodily fluids being left behind in order to transfer. A couple specific items I could think of, maybe the red ball from the ball gag would have a lot of DNA on it that potentially could have been moved around, but none of those items had a particular large amount of what I would think of as a blood type stain. So I'm less worried. I mean, maybe if that was present, I might have said, hey, let's package them all separately, but if there's no obvious blood staining when we first open that toolbox, I'm not very worried about any blood moving around because there just wasn't a whole lot to begin with necessarily in there.
And in reference to that L6, the Reebok gloves, your initial view of those, and I think you indicated in record, I think it's record number 4. Where this was the morning after you had recovered them, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. So People's Exhibit 231, record number 4, was when I first examined all of the items in the toolbox. There was, on that Reebok gloves, I believe it was the right glove, there were 3 areas that piqued my interest. Using the bright light, there were 3 areas of discoloration that I tested. Initially, 2 of them using the phenolphthalein testing, and I selected that test for a variety of reasons, but that's a good test. 2 of those areas did not indicate the presence of blood. That 3rd area did give some indication for blood. Now, when I followed it up with hemotrace, it was either not human blood or I didn't get enough of a sample because it was just a pretty weak stain to begin with. But that hemotrace test was negative. So initially, that stain was not forwarded for DNA analysis. Now, is what it is. There was some kind of a discoloration that caused me to do that testing, but it wasn't like your large pool of blood that you see on TV.
I guess my question is that you observed those stains the day after you found that toolbox.
That's correct.
Correct?
That's correct.
And I don't know, when it was resubmitted, did you go back into the areas where those stains were and make sure you swabbed those areas?
Yeah, so when they were resubmitted and analyzed under Record 17, which is People's Exhibit 235, some of the requests for each of those pairs of gloves was to swab the external surfaces, and even then the request was much more in an attempt, hey, let's try to get any contact DNA from somebody who would have not necessarily been wearing them, but somebody who would have been touched by those gloves. And so while I did look for that stain, I didn't have a specific note that it was still present, intact. It wasn't as visible as obvious. And so the swabbing at that point in time, in July of 2016, was really just for all of those exterior surfaces of the glove.
And, the other question I had as it relates to that, you had mentioned, obviously you don't have a large space where because Muskegon County isn't the only agency sending you stuff to be analyzed, right?
That's correct.
There are a lot of other agencies.
That's correct.
So you don't have this large storage area where you're storing everybody's stuff for them.
That's correct.
Now, I had asked some of your colleagues this question. If something is either submitted or resubmitted and it's not packaged correctly, you talked about being packaged correctly, integrity, all that. If it's not packaged correctly, is that something that you note?
Yeah, so any item that comes into the laboratory, if it's not properly sealed in an appropriate container and completely sealed with evidence tape in order to really maintain that chain of custody, our front desk staff will catch all of that and get after those officers to make sure it's closed up properly. Occasionally we might get a piece of evidence that comes through and somebody missed it and it wasn't sealed properly. if that's the case, then I will typically write that right into the report. The other thing I like to do on at least the serology ones is to specifically describe the containers as being one sealed manila envelope, one sealed brown paper bag, just to further reinforce this idea that when I received this item originally, it was sealed. When I received the bags or this piece of evidence, it was sealed originally. And so that definitely is something that I would note. If there was anything less than a sealed, good, preserved condition, then it is something that I would have noted.
And is there anything in the evidence that you, and I don't care if it's from the time that you first started to the time anything was resubmitted, is there anything that caused you any concern about the integrity or the integrity of the evidence that you were examining?
Not during the analysis portions. A couple of pieces of evidence that we've shown here today have already been opened before I received them on the stand, but during all of the evidence analysis processing during this case, everything has been received at a standard that I would expect.
Thank you, sir. I have no additional questions.
Okay, sir. You mentioned during your testimony that initially you were testing for 4 people. MJN, Blech, Handgun, and Willis. Do you recall?
That's correct. Those are the 4 individuals that I had reference samples from initially.
Why weren't you testing for Kevin Bloom initially?
I had not received his sample at that point, so it wasn't available to me.
Besides whose sample you get? Did you ask for a sample, or they simply submitted?
So if there is investigative information that I know of for a specific individual, I will request samples from that. A lot of times I'm not in the day-to-day for the investigators, so obviously there may be a host of other names associated that have come up during the investigations that I have no knowledge of. Some of that we do rely upon the investigators to bring in appropriate samples for comparison.
Do you know which it was on this occasion? Did you request it, or was it provided to you?
I do not recall.
Do you remember when you began to test for Mr. Bloom?
The first instance that it came in actually is when I received it first. People's Exhibit 227 is when it first came into the laboratory. And this is from lab number GR143508. That's the Rebecca Blech case in our lab system. Record number 28 is where it was submitted. Again, these are the only records that I did on that specific case. A reference sample buccal swab from Kevin Bloom was submitted. It looks like it came into the laboratory on July 19 of 2016. I took a cutting sampling of it, put it into a tube, forwarded it for DNA. I actually did do the DNA analysis process, and it looks like it was available for comparison sometime in the middle of September 2016. So it would be my understanding that at that point, any of the other new records should probably have been compared with him included in that list. But because I didn't write all of the reports, I can't guarantee that.
You mentioned earlier that the date is approximately 2 years from the date where Ms. Blech was killed, and you did your search of the vehicle. Would it have surprised you to find out that had fluids gone into that toolbox 2 years prior, that some or all of them may evaporate over time?
I would not. Random fluids I may expect to evaporate over time. The types of fluids that I'm typically testing for, your bodily fluids, seminal fluids, saliva, or blood, I would not expect them to evaporate and disappear in the sense that I think a lot of people think of. When liquids are deposited, it may dry onto a surface. So it may dry onto one of the surfaces of the items within that toolbox. But that DNA doesn't suddenly disappear. I would expect it, if there was a large blood stain to be present there initially, depending on those storage conditions, I would expect it to be stable within that toolbox over that type of a time frame.
Do you know if this is the same toolbox that my client possessed back in 2016, or is this a different one?
In 2016?
Yes, when Ms. Blech was killed.
In 2014.
Thank you.
Yeah. In 2016 is the toolbox that we recovered from the minivan. I have no knowledge of where this toolbox has been at any time prior to May 17 of 2016.
Did you examine the walls and floor of the toolbox as you did your examination?
Yeah, the examination of the toolbox, I would have looked at all of the surfaces. So
The interior, I mean.
the interior and the exterior of the toolbox. Mostly items would have come out, and then the interior examination would have happened. But yeah.
Thank you.
I have nothing else, Judge.
Well, I think you're done. You can stand now, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, next witness, please.
Thank you, Judge. People of the state of Michigan call Jeff Crump to the stand.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please have a seat. State your name for the record.
My name's Jeff Crump, C-R-U-M-P.
Okay. Lieutenant Crump, thank you for your patience. I know you've been here all day, so I appreciate it.
No problem.
You work for, and maybe you already announced this, so I apologize if you already have. What department do you work for?
Michigan State Police in the Grand Rapids Forensic Lab in the Firearms Unit.
Okay. And how long have you worked in the firearms unit?
A little over 19 years.
And in fact, are you the supervisor of that unit?
I am.
Now, as part of working in that particular unit, do you have a particular education that you have to obtain?
Well, you don't have to, but I have a master's degree from Michigan State University with an emphasis in, or the master's degree is in criminal justice with an emphasis in forensic science. However, the training program for a firearms examiner is different, so that is a 2-year training program, much like an apprenticeship, where you work underneath an experienced examiner for that 2 years. Majority of that training is hands-on casework. At the end of the training program, you are given competency and proficiency tests. If you pass those, then you're allowed to work independently. However, anytime we do have an identification, it's always verified by another examiner.
Okay. And is there some sort of continuing, I mean, do you have continuing legal education throughout the course of your employ at the state police in this area?
I'm a member of the Association of Firearms and Toolmark Examiners, so we get quarterly journals in the field regarding current research and recent topics. I also take yearly proficiency tests in firearms and tool marks. They're 2 separate tests, so there's 2 per year. And I pass those every year, and that is the extent of the ongoing training, unless there are some training classes that pop up that I might get to go to occasionally.
All right. And over the course of your many years working in the firearms unit, I'm assuming you've conducted several examinations, both as it relates to shell casings, fired fragments, and handguns themselves.
Several thousand, sure.
And over the course of your career, how many times have you been asked to testify in court?
I'm probably around 120.
And of those times, have you been qualified as an expert in your field?
Yes.
Has there been any time that you haven't been qualified as an expert?
No.
Your Honor, I would move for Lieutenant Crump be treated as an expert in the area of firearms, including shell casing identification and fragment identification, as well as comparisons with reference samples.
Right here.
You may.
Lieutenant Crump, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Fred Johnson, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
A question. You've testified 127 times as an expert?
Approximately 120 times.
Okay. And are you always involved in criminal cases? Do you testify also in civil matters?
No, we do not do civil matters.
Okay. And when you're called to testify, are you always called by a prosecutor or our defense counsel called you to testify?
I have been called by defense also.
How often did you think?
Not very many. If I'm remembering it right, it's maybe a couple times.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions, Your Honor. And I have no objection to Lieutenant Crump's qualification.
Okay. The witness will be examined as an expert in the field proper. You may proceed, Mr. Wilson, on that basis.
Thank you. Lieutenant Crump, I don't want to make this into a college class, but I would like to at least provide the jury some background in what you do and what you're looking for. And I know you brought a prop with you. Let's talk about the, I'm talking about the prop you guys sitting right there.
Right.
Oh, okay. Let's talk about guns in general, how they're manufactured, and why police departments in state polices across the nation have these firearm units.
Sure. A long time ago, we're talking probably a little over 100 years ago now, it was determined or found that fired bullets and fired cartridge cases were observed to have markings on them after they were fired. A theory was developed back then when this was noticed that a fired cartridge case or fired bullet fired in a particular firearm would have unique markings on that item from the firearm, and that those markings would be unique from one firearm to the next. And that theory has been tested over and over again throughout the 100 years and found to be valid and reliable. So those markings, when a firearm is manufactured, it's manufactured using a number of different tools. Those tools are constantly changing from one firearm to the next. Therefore, it's leaving behind those unique marks within the firearm.
Now, as it relates to, let's stick with the firearm in the barrel. What about the barrel makes a fired bullet identifiable later on?
Well, again, a barrel, when it's manufactured, there's some type of tooling that is used to create what's called the rifling within the barrel. Those are also called lands and grooves. And here, this here would be a cross section of a barrel where you can see two raised portions. Those are what we call the lands, and then the depressed portions are what we call the grooves. And again, because of the tooling used, once the tool is pulled or pushed through this barrel to create this rifling, the cutting surfaces of that tool have just changed. So then when you go to the next barrel and cut that next barrel, it's going to have different imperfections in that barrel versus the previous one. Then when we fire a bullet through that barrel, the microscopic imperfections are basically just leaving scratches, or what we call striations, on the surface of the bullet. Those are what we try to examine and look for underneath what we call a comparison microscope, where we can view two items at the same time and see if we can get those individual characteristics to match up.
Now, as it relates to shell casings, do shell casings have similar unique characteristics to them that allow you to make comparisons later on?
They do. If we're talking about a centerfire case, which is a casing where we have a primer in the middle of the back of the cartridge where the firing pin strikes the primer, ignites the priming mixture inside, which ignites the powder in the cartridge, which then pushes the bullet out the barrel because of the pressure of that burning powder. You get, because of that pressure, you get a rearward motion. That's why a gun kicks when you fire it, because of that pressure. Any imperfections on the back of that, what we call a breech face of the firearm that the casing sits against, those imperfections can transfer over to the back of the cartridge case. There's also extractor, ejector, firing pin marks and chamber marks that we look for. All those, again, are unique to the firearm when it was manufactured. If we're talking about a rimfire cartridge, which I don't have an example of, what we really generally look for on those is when the firing pin strikes the rim of the cartridge to fire it, we use generally the firing pin impression to look for to say, hey, this was fired in this firearm or was not. We don't really get the breech face marks on the rimfire cartridges.
And so it's safe to say you can find imperfections on shell casings taken from the scene, either on the face, I think you call it the breech.
Breech face.
What about on the casing itself?
Those would be chamber marks. So we could have chamber marks on the outside of the casing. If my hand is the chamber of the firearm, again, when you fire this cartridge, it creates pressure. The cartridge case expands within the chamber, and then when it is pulled out, if you have imperfections in your chamber, it basically, again, it's going to leave scratches or striations on the outside of your cartridge case. We could have an extractor mark. An extractor is what pulls the cartridge out of the chamber. And then we could have an ejector mark, which kicks the cartridge case out of the firearm if we're talking about a semi-automatic pistol.
All right. Let's talk about what you did in this particular case. In particular, were you provided some shell casing? I'll start with the shell casing first. You provided some shell casing from the scene of the Rebecca Blech homicide.
I was.
All right. I'm going to hand you what's marked as People's 152 and 153. Does that look like the shell casing you
Is this open, or you just want me to look at the exterior?
Just the exterior.
Oh, okay.
Just the exterior.
Yes, we have container 3, which is supposed to contain 1 fired cartridge case, and then container 4, which is supposed to contain 2 fired cartridge cases. And all of those are 22 long rifle caliber with the head stamp of C.
And before I give you the report here, head stamp of C, does that mean anything to you?
That generally indicates that the manufacturer or marketer of that ammunition is CCI.
Okay. And I'm going to hand you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 239. What are we looking at in that particular report?
This is a copy of my report regarding those fired cartridge cases and also some other items.
All right. Now, behind you and certainly to your side, items 3, 4A, and 4B, is that referenced in that particular exhibit? The your report, I'm sorry.
Yes, item 3, items 4A and 4B are referenced in the report.
And are those the 3 shell casings that we're talking about here that are in 152 and 153?
Yes.
Okay. Now, could you describe to the jury, and if need be, you can either stand straight up or, there it is, yep. Describe for the jury what your analysis was of those 3 shell casings from the back.
Sure. Well, first I'll point out that these are rimfire cartridges. So they're 22 long or long rifle caliber. And being rimfire, you don't have the primer in the center of this cartridge. All the priming mixtures in the rim of this cartridge, and the firing pin of whatever firearm you're using has to strike the rim of the cartridge to fire it. That's why these impressions are here. These are all firing pin impressions. And these are all the C head stamps that I mentioned.
Okay, now based on your view of those 3 shell casings, were you able to make a determination or a conclusion as to whether or not they came from the same gun?
Initially, when I examined these, I found them to all have matching chamber marks, and then I found them to have similar individual characteristics within the firing pin impression. So to take that a little bit further, when I say similar individual characteristics within the firing pin impression, at the time I didn't have a gun. I wasn't sure if those individual characteristics were consistent enough to make an identification, so I was being conservative with those and not making a result with those markings. I originally just made the result conclusions using the chamber marks.
Okay. And ultimately, the conclusion was what?
That they had matching chamber marks that would have been produced by the same firearm.
All right. So items 3, 4A, and 4B, you're confident were all fired from the same firearm?
Well, we can't use chamber marks to say they were fired in the same firearm. We can only use those to say they were minimally chambered and extracted from that firearm.
Gotcha. Okay, understood. But each one of them had matching characteristics with one another on the chamber.
Matching chamber marks,
Okay.
yes.
Now, you mentioned also that you received, along with those, shell casings, a few other items. In particular, some additional, well, let's talk about the firearms. So it would be 12A, 12B, 13A through C, and 14.
Yes.
What was the point of giving that to you?
Well, the agency at the time, I think, was collecting firearms that they perhaps thought could be involved or wanted to know if they were involved, so they were given to me in order to test fire them and compare the test shots to the evidence.
Let's talk about that before I ask you for your conclusions on those. When you receive, so you've got, your scene evidence, whether it be shell casings or fired rounds. What process do you go through when firearms come in for comparison purposes? What do you do?
Well, we'll examine the evidence first, but then if we do have a firearm, we always have to test fire that firearm, and when I say test fire, that means we're shooting into a water tank, we're collecting the fired bullets, and we're collecting the fired cartridge cases. Those are our exemplars, our known samples. Once we collect those, then we can take them to the comparison microscope where I can, I have 2 stages. I can put evidence on one stage and a test shot on the other stage. And when I look through the viewfinder, I can see both of those items at the same time through a split screen. We magnify the microscopic imperfections or individual characteristics that are on them to try to determine, do these sufficiently match so we can render an opinion.
And in the firearms that you were provided, located at items 12, 13, and 14, did any one of those firearms match to what you had as far as the shell casings, and we'll get to the fragments here in just a second.
So none of them matched. A majority of them can be eliminated based on different firing pin shapes. Some of the guns could be eliminated based on different land and groove impressions and or widths.
All right. So were any one of those submitted under that lab number, a weapon that fired the shell casings 3, 4, 4A, and 4B.
No, none of those firearms were associated to the evidence.
All right. Handing you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 154 and 155. Can you describe what that is?
Container 15 holds 2 fired lead bullets. One is item 15A, one's item 15B, and then 2 fragments, which are my items 15C. And then container 17 holds a fired lead bullet, my item number 17.
All right. I want to go through a couple of photo exhibits just so you can describe or show the jury when we're talking about comparison purposes for the rim stuff. So Exhibit 133. Give me 1 second here. What are we looking at? What is this?
So this is one of the evidence fired cartridge cases, item number 3. Item number 3 on the left-hand side, and a test shot, which is going to be T1/12A, which is one of the firearms submitted initially. And all I'm doing here is showing the difference in the firing pin impressions. And you can clearly see that they are different. This is kind of a rounded rectangular shape, and this one is basically a circular shape. That difference allows us to say that this firearm is eliminated as having fired this cartridge based on that difference.
Okay. Exhibit 134.
Again, just another picture showing the different shapes and sizes of those firing pins. Again, we have item number 3 on the left. We have a test shot from item number 13A on the right, and that's also an elimination.
All right. Now the fragments, which you've already described, were you able, was there any characteristics of the fragments that you were able to, that you were given to look at that helped or was going to help you in this investigation?
When you say fragments, are you specifically talking about item 15C there? As how?
When I say fragments, I'm just talking about them all together.
All of them?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to classify them as fragments. I know that's probably not the way I should do it, but it's easier for me. So I'm talking about 15A, 15B, and 15C. Was there anything in your analysis of those items that you felt was going to be useful to you later on in this investigation?
Well, during the examination of a fired bullet, our first thing that we do is what we call classify it, and that is to try to determine what caliber it is and potentially what type of firearm it was fired from. In order to classify something, we first will weigh it, we'll measure the diameter, and we'll count the land and groove impressions that are on it and determine, is it a right twist, is it a left twist, and then we'll measure those land and groove impressions, put that information into a database, and see what type of firearms come back as possible suspect firearms.
And even though there was not a lot of quantity to work with, were you able to do any of that analysis for those items?
Yes, I was able to do that with 15A and 15B.
All right. What did you determine?
Well, again, in the original examination, before I had a firearm, because when you compare fired bullets that are damaged to each other, they may not have sufficient individual characteristics to compare to each other. So my initial results were that 15 15A, 15B, and 17 are consistent with being 22 class caliber rim-fired, fired lead bullets, and they have 6 lands and grooves with a right twist, and they lack sufficient individual matching characteristics for an identification to each other, but may be suitable for comparison purposes to test shots from a suspect firearm. So basically, in comparison to each other, it was an inconclusive result at that time.
But you're letting investigators know that if they have as they submit firearms, there may be enough characteristics from these items to compare them to test shots, essentially.
Sure, because when we obtain test shots, we're just shooting into water, so you basically get a pristine bullet, and the individual characteristics on those test shots should be sufficient enough to compare back to something that potentially is damaged and may not have as much individual characteristics.
We're looking at 135, and you mentioned item 17, that's in 136, is that correct? The picture, sorry.
Item 17 is what now?
Is People's Exhibit 136, is being
Oh.
depicted in 136.
Yes.
So item 17, because you had mentioned the 3, and then this 4th one for 7.
Correct, yes, that's the other item.
Now, you mentioned that you were able to, based on the weight and what you were able to find some lands and grooves. Besides 22 caliber, were you able to potentially give investigators something else to look for as far as a potential firearm?
Well, we later determined by looking at that firing pin impression on those 3 fired cartridge cases that they seem most consistent with a particular type of firearm, and where we haven't seen that on any other firearm but that type. So yes, eventually I did tell investigators that they should be looking for a particular type of firearm.
What firearm was that?
A Walther P22.
Okay. Now, and so essentially, what you've talked about as far as the fragments, the fragments and the shell casings, that's contained in People's Exhibit 239, which is your record 3.
Yes.
Up to this point.
Yes.
Anything about that report that's different than when you send it out originally?
Yes, I did do a corrected copy on that report recently.
Okay.
That's the one where I had the MUPD instead of the MCSD.
You had the wrong police department.
Correct.
So you had Muskegon Police as opposed to Muskegon Sheriff's Department.
Correct.
And you changed that.
Yes.
Okay. And I think, is that reflected?
That is not. This would be the old
all right.
copy. Yes.
Fair enough. We'll get a new copy. Now, during the course of the Rebecca Blech investigation, were you submitted, or were firearms submitted to you to essentially make comparison purposes?
Yes, I received a number of different firearms at different times.
Okay. All right, Henny was marked as People's Exhibit 240. What are we looking at in this report, sir?
This is record number 6, where 2 other firearms were submitted to test fire and compared to the recovered evidence.
And could you make any comparisons, or were they eliminated?
Both of the firearms were eliminated as having fired the fired cartridge cases, due to different class characteristics, meaning, again, different firing pin size and shape. Then I eliminated one of the firearms as having fired the bullets because of different class rifling specifications. And then the other firearm was not eliminated because the rifling specifications are the same, so I can eliminate them based on that, but they didn't have sufficient matching individual characteristics for an ID, so basically it was an inconclusive result.
Okay. And that changed after a period of time, is that correct? In other words, once a firearm was discovered in May of 2016, did that, or does that inconclusive result remain today?
Well,
You understand my question?
I do. First of all, let me point out that the cartridge case from that firearm is eliminated, but the bullet from the same firearm is essentially not because of the same rifling characteristics. So different manufacturers can have the same rifling specs within their firearms, but the cartridge case itself could be eliminated.
Gotcha.
So that's why I'm sure there's a little bit of confusion there, but essentially, once we make an identification to a firearm, then theoretically all other firearms can be eliminated.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, I'm going to hand you a series of different lab reports. This is People's Exhibit 241 through 244. You could just briefly talk about each one and what was happening. So 241 is what?
241 is where items 3, 4A, and 4B, which are the fired cartridge cases, were being resubmitted at my request, so I could put them in what we call our open shooting file. Basically, I'm just keeping those there at the lab because I knew the agency was going to be more than likely submitting more guns for comparison. This eliminates them from having to keep bringing those back with every firearm. Exhibit 242 is where three firearms were submitted for test fire and comparison to the evidence.
And what were you able to determine off of that?
Okay. So, one of those items is a Walther P22. So that firearm could not be identified or eliminated, so it's inconclusive, as having fired item 3, which was one of the cartridge cases that was resubmitted that I used for comparison to that firearm. The reason it was inconclusive was because it didn't display sufficient individual characteristics for an ID. However, I can eliminate it because it's the same type of firearm, therefore it has the same class characteristics as in any other Walther P22.
All right.
Let's see, item 40, which was a Phoenix Arms, that was eliminated as having fired that fired cartridge case. Additionally, the other firearm, which was a Browning, was also eliminated as having fired that fired cartridge case.
Okay. What's the next lab?
People's Exhibit 243, which is a supplemental report indicating that the fired cartridge cases, items 3, 4A, and 4B, were compared to another firearm that was submitted by Muskegon Heights Police Department, and that that firearm was not identified or eliminated, again inconclusive, as having fired that evidence. Differences in individual characteristics and possible class characteristics would suggest that these items were fired from a different firearm.
Okay. Next report?
People's Exhibit 244 was the submission of a Walther P22, and that was eliminated as having fired the fired cartridge cases and the fired bullets as I had previously identified them to another firearm.
Okay. Let's talk about the discovery of this particular Walther P22, and ultimately it was turned in to you at the lab. This is People's Exhibit 191. Have you grabbed that for just a second? I want to first talk about, and up on the screen is People's Exhibit 137. Do you recall receiving what's the firearm in People's Exhibit 191 in the lab?
Yes.
All right. Does it contain your markings?
Yes, it's marked with my tag that has the lab number, the date, and my initials on the tag.
All right. Specifically, I want to talk about when you first received it, were you able to make a determination, or were you able to readily make a determination of the serial number of that gun?
I wasn't.
Why is that?
It had been defaced.
I'm sorry?
It had been defaced, or otherwise somebody had appeared to have tried to remove the serial number so it wasn't readable by scratching it out.
Now, does the lab have capabilities of restoring serial numbers?
We do.
How do you do that?
Basically, what we do is we smooth out the area where the serial number is supposed to be. We smooth out that metal, and then we apply an acid to it, which slowly brings up the serial number in like a shadow form. If that obliteration or defacing of the serial number hasn't gone too deep within the metal surface. If it's not too deep, then we can usually recover it using that acid.
And were you able to restore the serial number on this particular gun?
I was.
Showing you, this is People's Exhibit 139. Based on that restoration, what serial number do we have?
We have the serial number of L397098, which here is the main area of where the serial number is stamped. This is where I did the restoration. However, this firearm is stamped with a secondary serial number by the manufacturer, which I also found and was able to say that that serial number is the same as what I recovered.
I'm going to show you what is People's Exhibit 207. It's some gun paperwork from a Michelle Schnatella. Does the serial number that you recovered match the serial number of the purchased weapon back in May of 2012?
Yes, it does.
And that's for a Walther P22, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
All right. Okay. Now, did you also begin your analysis as far as both shell casing and fired bullet?
Yes, I did.
All right. Let's look at People's Exhibit 140. And if the television screen might be a little bit better, which is right over here, you could explain to the jury what we're looking at.
Well, what we're looking at here, if you look down the center of this picture, there's a black line that separates the two different items. On the left side is lab number GR14-3508, and on this side, the right side, is GR16-2492 with the corresponding agency numbers underneath. And then the item numbers, item number 3 on the left, and test shot T9 from L38, which is the item number for this Walther P22 is L38, and T9 is the test shot number. So what I'm showing here is a progression of chamber marks down the side of this one particular section of these cartridge cases, the evidence and the test shot. And we're at a magnification of 20, and I'm just starting to show some agreement of chamber marks here.
All right.
And then the pictures progress down the side, and you can see all of these different marks that start to.
And maybe you could point out to the jury on their television screen which marks you're talking about as I make our way down.
So again, we're just starting with this pretty heavy mark here, and we're just getting into some agreement with these marks down here.
So I'm going to move to People's Exhibit 141. Same two, I guess,
Right.
Go ahead.
Right. Same evidence, number 3 on the left, same test shot on the right. And what I'm just doing is I'm slowly moving the cartridge cases over to show we're in the same orientation. I'm just starting to show more agreement within these chamber marks. You've got this big area here, this line here, start to show this line down here and this one down here.
Okay. And 142.
Again, just more agreement. We have the same items moving down the fired cartridge cases, and we're showing more agreement within these areas right here.
And again, the solid line down the middle is separating the two. I think you said the left side is the evidence, right
Correct.
side is the test shot.
Correct. The dark line down the center of this picture denotes when I'm looking through the viewfinder of the microscope, you've got one item on one side and the other item on the left side.
And that just so we're clear, when you're firing test shots, you're actually firing that weapon.
Yes.
Okay. It's not some other weapon. You're firing the weapon that's been submitted.
This test shot here, L38T9, is out of item L38, this Walther P22.
All right. Let's talk about, did you have an opportunity to then make some comparisons, the test fired lead bullets with the submitted lead bullets.
Yes.
All right. This is going to be People's Exhibit 143. Describe to the jury what we're looking at in this particular photograph.
Again, we have our line down the center. We've got item 17 on the left and test shot T11 from L38, the firearm, on the right. And what I'm beginning to show here is some agreement here, 3 lines close together right here, or striations. Some agreement down here where we've got a softer show. Instead of a white line, we have some darker lines because the light's not getting in there. And then we have agreement here also.
Now, the difference, just so the jury is aware, the evidence that you received, the fragments themselves, were they copper jacketed?
Not jacketed, but coated.
Coated.
Coated. So 22 rimfire ammunition can have a copper coating, which you can see here on this. My test shot is just of a lead bullet. That this particular test shot does not have the copper coating on it.
Okay. People's Exhibit 144. What are we looking at in this photograph?
We are looking at, again, item 17 to test shot number 11. And I'm showing agreement here, 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 a little bit here, a little bit down there.
Okay. Then moving on to Exhibit 145. What are we looking at in this photograph?
Still item 17 and test shot 11. And we're looking at this agreement here, 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 here. And remember, I've kind of stopped this in a location where I'm finding the most agreement. But some of these lines you have to follow out farther. It may not, you may not have this line with this line here. Sometimes you have to move those bullets back and forth and track that line across, and you can still see some agreement. But what I've done is stopped where, at this particular place where I was finding the most agreement that I could photograph at the time.
All right. People's Exhibit 146. What do we have going on here?
This is a different evidence item. This is item 15B to test shot T11. And showing agreement here, but pretty much agreement all the way down there. I got a glare on that TV when I get under it, but yeah, that's showing the agreement in that area.
All right. So now the previous photographs we were talking about item 17 of the evidence. Now we're looking at item 15B.
Right.
Okay. All right. 147.
15B again to T11. We'll just get it on a different area of the bullet. All those previous areas that we showed were in different locations on the bullet. And again, I'm showing pretty good agreement right here and there.
Okay. And finally, People's Exhibit 148.
This one's
This is a different piece of evidence, correct?
15A to test shot 11. This one's a little bit harder to see. I'm at the very end of this land impression, but because of the deformation of the bullet, these striations started curving upward, but the agreement was right in that area, down at the bottom of that land impression.
Okay. Now, based on, you can go ahead and see.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Handing you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 245, which is your record 6. Is that the lab report that kind of, in a nutshell, summarizes the work that you've kind of gone through with the jury, both on the shell casings and on the fired bullets?
Yes, it does.
And as it relates to the shell casings, were you able to make any conclusions as to whether or not they were fired from that particular Walther P-22, which is People's Exhibit 191?
Yes, I was.
What were those conclusions?
That the fired cartridge cases 3, 4A, and 4B were identified as having been fired from that firearm,
Okay.
from item L38.
And in the same vein, were you able to make any conclusions as it relates to the fired bullets received in evidence in your testing?
Yeah, additionally, the fired bullets, items 15A, 15B, and 17 were identified as having been fired from the submitted Walther P-22.
So the shell casings that were submitted to you from the Rebecca Blech scene, it's your opinion and conclusion they were fired from that gun?
Yes.
And the bullet fragments that were recovered from Rebecca Blech's head and turned to law enforcement, turned to you, your opinion and conclusion is those fragments were fired from that gun?
Yes.
Okay. I've got the corrected copy. This just make sure that is the correct one before I submit all these reports.
Okay, for record 25. You want to make sure which one is correct?
That's all right. Well, Your Honor, I'm gonna move, well, first let me ask you these questions. On from People's Exhibit 240, 241, 242, 243, 244, and 245 were all those reports that you had offered.
Yes.
And based on, was there anything outside of, or was there anything different in the original report that you submitted that is different in these exhibits?
No.
All right, and that last report, People's Exhibit 245, is the conclusions you made to the shell casing and the fired bullets as it relates to, as you described, L38 with People's Exhibit 191.
Yes.
All right. Your Honor, I move for the admission of People's Exhibits 240 through 245.
Can we see the corrected copies?
Those are all ballistics reports?
I haven't showed that one.
Those are all ballistics reports?
All ballistics, yes, sir.
May I see the document?
One moment, please, Your Honor. Your Honor, we have no objections to the documents being admitted.
Exhibits 240 through 245 are listed.
For some reason, Judge, I thought I had, I've got a corrected, Lieutenant Crump had talked about a corrected copy for record number 3, and I thought I had that, but I don't. I'd be happy to show. I've showed defense counsel, and I think Lieutenant Crump has described it. But I'm happy to show defense counsel again and mark the true copy. I think he's testified to what's changed. So conditionally, until I do that, I'd like to move for the admission of 239, so I don't have to keep the jury or Lieutenant Crump sitting here. I don't want to have to run and make a copy, but I just want to make sure that we get the right lab report in.
Your Honor, conditionally, and again, obviously, it's either a change copy, we won't object to this charge.
Is that something you're looking at?
Sure, sure. While he's cross-examining, he's doing that. Yep.
239 will be received also.
Okay. I have no other questions of Lieutenant Crump.
Lieutenant Crump, when did you make that change we're talking about? From the Muskegon County Police, Muskegon City Police to the...
It would say on the report, sir, I think it was maybe a month ago or so.
Okay. And you submitted it?
Yes.
Okay. And by the way, good afternoon. I'm Fred Johnson.
Good afternoon.
How many test shots did you take into the barrel, into the water?
Well, let me look it up.
How many test shots did you take into the barrel, into the water?
Well, let me look it up. I took 12 in all.
Okay, and how many did you compare to the known samples that you received, evidentiary samples?
Well, they were all compared.
So you compared all 12 of them?
Yeah, I look at everything, but I don't document everything with a photograph.
And did all 12 match up as the 2 that you ultimately chose to document?
That I don't recall because we only need to have 2 that have sufficient matching individual characteristics. We don't need to have all 12. We just need 2 samples that match.
Why? Who says so? Who says you only need 2?
Our policies.
Okay, so let me just state policy, if you got 2 that match, you grab those 2 and you don't need to document the other 10.
We have to have at least 2 that show sufficient matching individual characteristics within the test shots
Okay?
that compare back to the evidence. We can't use just 1 because we can't then demonstrate that that gun is consistently marking.
Why don't you just shoot 2? I mean, let me explain my confusion. If all the bullets that come out of that gun are going to have these markings, why don't you just shoot 2 bullets and be done with it?
Well, they may not all have consistent markings. So in this case, I took some test shots using just lead bullets.
Yes, sir.
I also took some test shots using copper-coated bullets. Those could be, because of the coating difference, could show different individual characteristics. So right from the get-go, I knew that. So instead of taking a few test shots, looking at them on the scope, taking a few more, looking at the scope, I just fired 12 all at the same time.
You anticipate my next question. You've got the lead bullets next to the copper-coated bullets, and the reason for that, if you explain for me again, why not just use consistently all copper, or when you got all copper examples?
Well, because this copper coating on this particular bullet could allow the individual characteristics to not transfer over as well onto the bullet. So if I use just a lead bullet, I'm assured to get probably more of the individual characteristics transferring over to just lead because I don't have that copper coating that's getting in the way.
But for the lead, but for the copper coating, are you using identical ammunition for your test shots?
I'm using similar.
You're using similar.
Yes.
So the test shots may or may not be from the same manufacturer?
Well, the test shots were, so I took 6 test shots 3 were copper-coated with the C head stamp, or CCI. 3 were lead bullets with a F head stamp for federal. That was because I had 2 evidence magazines submitted. I took 6 test shots with one of those magazines, and I took 6 test shots with the other magazine.
Did you have identical ammunition that you could have, from the same manufacturer with the same copper coating that you could have used for your test shot?
Yeah, and as I said, I took 3 test shots using a CCI ammo that's copper-coated with one magazine and 3 more with the other magazine. So I did use similar ammunition from the same manufacturer or marketer.
Thank you. How about my nomenclature here? You got bullets and fragments. Is that correct? Is that the correct nomenclature? Or do you get shells and fragments? What did you get?
Altogether,
No,
everything
I mean
in
the projectile, the bullet, the things that were you compared for accuracy for.
the things that I identified, I called fired lead bullets.
Okay. How many fired lead bullets did you receive?
3.
Did you match the lead bullets, the 3 lead bullets against one another to determine if they were shot from the same gun?
No, if you remember earlier when initially I was looking at them to each other, because of the damage associated with them, and again we have a copper coating which sometimes prevents the individual characteristics from being transferred over to the bullet when it's fired to the firearm. I looked at them, I saw similarities, but I declined to ID them at that point until I got a firearm to compare them back to. So originally they were inconclusive to each other.
But once you got the firearm and were able to compare, did you compare them back to one another?
I compared them to the test shots. I had already compared them to one another.
Okay. So even getting the firearm, that won't help you compare them to one another. You're still going to be inconclusive as to whether or not they came from the same firearm.
If I didn't have a firearm and I was still trying to look at them to each other, then it would still be an inconclusive result.
Okay. But now you've got a firearm.
Yes.
Did you? Help me here. You got a firearm. You were able to compare. Were you able to compare them to each other once you got the firearm and make a conclusion?
I compared them to test shots. I
Okay.
didn't compare them to each other again because I had already done that. So I take one evidence item, compare it to the test shots, make an identification. I take the next evidence item, compare it to the test shots, make an identification, and so on.
All right. And all the test shots matched up from that gun matched up to the fire bullets that you had to test with.
The
In other words, you used your test shots against all 3 shots controlled.
So I used 3 test shots, T1, T2, and T7. Are we? I'm sorry. Are we still talking about the bullets or also the fire cartridge cases?
The bullets.
The bullets. Okay. So for the bullets, I used 3 of them.
Yes, sir.
T10, T11, and T12.
Okay. And all 3 of them were compared against test shots?
Yes.
And all 3 matched up with test shots?
Yes.
So you're convinced that all 3 came from the same gun?
Yes.
Okay. That's one moment, please. Thank you. Then I have no further questions.
Thanks, sir.
Mr. Hilson, have you read
I really don't. I'm just going to give Lieutenant Crump his lab report back, and I thank the bailiff for making a copy for me. And Mr. Johnson just so. I'm done with this. I'm sorry. Yeah, I apologize, Judge.
Okay, so you may stand up.
Thanks, sir.
Give me one. Sorry.
Oh, all right.
Your Honor, I don't get to the document and.
Exhibit Exhibit 239 will be received. And you may stand up.
Thanks, sir.
That's it. That's all I got. I've got one witness left. As the court recalls, she was not available